Hello everyone, I am MANO Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Ryan Carter. I'm 31 years old, and this happened in October 2023. It's nearly impossible for me to recount these events without my hands shaking, but I'll do my best to tell the truth in all its dark detail. Maybe by writing it down, I can convince myself I survived something real, and not a twisted nightmare. It started as an innocent escape into the wilderness and ended as a confrontation with something that defies any logic I once believed in. I drove to Savage River State Forest, up in western Maryland, with my dog, Bruno, in the passenger seat. Bruno was an older German Shepherd mix, 8 years old, strong and sharp, but friendly once he knew you. I had meant for this trip to be just 3 or 4 nights of solitude along the Monroe Run Trail, a chance to clear my head. I'd lost my job in September. Cutbacks, they said, just the cost of doing business. On top of that, my girlfriend left me around the same time. I guess I had been too closed off, too distracted, and we fell apart at the seams. I figured some quiet time in nature might help me find a sense of direction again. Growing up, I loved hiking with my grandpa out in the Appalachians. I wasn't a veteran or a Navy SEAL or anything like that, just a guy who enjoyed being out in the woods. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, but usually not this far off-grid. Savage River State Forest has an eerie beauty to it. It's a place of thick undergrowth, twisting pines, and rocky trails that can vanish beneath layers of fallen leaves. The air was crisp, the leaves in mid-turn, golden, red, fading green. I arrived at the trailhead just after noon on a Friday. It was quiet. I saw only one other car in the gravel lot, but no sign of its owner. Perfect. Solitude was exactly what I wanted. Bruno sniffed every inch of that lot, tail wagging. He always loved a good hike, but even then, I noticed a moment where he paused, hackles lifting along his back. He stared into the tree line, ears perked, letting out a low, uncertain whine. I assumed he was just excited or picking up an animal's scent. If only I had paid more attention to what he was trying to warn me about. I strapped on my pack, double-checked my phone, 85% battery, and started up the Monroe Run Trail. The forest felt close, like it was leaning in. Still, I found it comforting at first. Every step on the packed earth felt like shedding the stress of the world. My phone's GPS worked decently to mark my progress, though I also had a topographic map of the forest. I prefer an old-school paper map in case electronics fail. After a couple hours, I found a perfect campsite near a small creek. I set up my tent, let Bruno roam on a long lead while I gathered kindling. He barked a few times, but always came back when I called. By the time the sun slipped behind the canopy, I had a neat little fire crackling in the ring. All felt right in the world. My phone battery was at 70%, odd, because I'd barely used it. But I shrugged it off. Sometimes a phone battery can tank in the cooler weather. I turned it off to conserve power, laid out my sleeping bag, gave Bruno some dinner, and warmed up a meal packet for myself. I slept heavily that first night, lulled by the quiet of the forest. I only recall one strange detail. I dreamed I heard footsteps outside my tent. Light, careful footsteps, as though someone were circling. I half awoke at one point, fumbled for my flashlight, but everything was silent. I thought maybe Bruno had trotted around. I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I crawled out of the tent, blinking at the sunlight. Bruno was sitting at attention, tail thumping. I noticed right away that my pack was partially unzipped, and some of my dried food had spilled out. At the time, I figured Bruno got nosy or a raccoon had rummaged. I shrugged it off. I switched on my phone, 40%. It had lost 30% battery overnight even though it was off. A bit unsettling, but I didn't dwell on it. I turned it off again, deciding I'd rely on my watch and the paper map for navigation. We resumed the hike, aiming to push deeper toward the heart of the forest. By midday, we'd covered another 5 miles. The terrain was rugged in places, but I'd been prepared for that. Small footbridges over creeks, rocky ascents that tested my lungs. Bruno stayed close, occasionally running ahead to sniff the brush. Around 2 in the afternoon, I paused to check my map and realized I had no idea where I was in relation to the last marked point. The forest around me felt uncomfortably silent, and not a single blaze or signpost had caught my eye in the last hour. I took out the GPS on my phone to get a fix. Now, it wouldn't connect properly. The screen flickered, insisted I was off in some blank area with no marked trails. The name Carter's Loop flashed on the screen for a moment, like the trail had renamed itself after me. I blinked, then the phone died entirely. All right, no big deal, I muttered to myself. We've got the map. But the map seemed wrong. The topography lines didn't quite match what I was seeing. None of the listed creeks or ridges aligned with the real terrain. It was almost like the map had changed overnight, or I had picked up some other map by mistake. My eyes started to burn with frustration. I had never gotten lost like this before, and I couldn't figure out how it had happened so quickly. Bruno, meanwhile, stood by my side, tail low, ears back. His posture told me he sensed something off, and let me tell you, the air itself felt heavier, like the forest was leaning in even closer, trying to swallow us. I decided we'd return the way we came, back to the previous campsite. Maybe from there I could reorient myself. But retracing the trail was near impossible. Paths I remembered taking seemed to vanish, and new paths I hadn't noticed before opened like illusions. The day wore on, and by the time I saw the sun dipping behind the trees, my chest felt tight with anxiety. It was nearing twilight when I found a small clearing with a fire pit made of stones. There were half-burned logs inside, as if someone else had camped recently. Exhausted, I decided we'd spend the night there. We had enough supplies for a few days, even if it wasn't where I'd planned to stop. That night, as I tried to build a fire, every match I struck blew out almost instantly. I huddled over the kindling, guarding it from the breeze, but the flame simply wouldn't catch. After burning through nearly half my matches, a voice said, "Need some help?" I spun around. Standing not 10 feet away was a man I hadn't heard approach at all. He was tall, mid-30s maybe, with neatly parted brown hair, wearing a dark blue jacket and hiking pants. I could see no smudges of dirt on his boots, no leaves in his hair, no sweat. He smiled, warmly, if a little too perfectly. Who are you?" I asked, my heart still hammering from the shock of his sudden appearance. "Name's Elias," he replied. "Got lost out here myself. I've got some dry tinder if you want." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a handful of leaves and bark that looked bone dry. He knelt beside my pit, placed the tinder, and motioned for a match. I handed him one, and at his single strike, the flame came to life. A tall, bright blaze that quickly spread across the woodpile. I stared. "That's weird. I tried that for 20 minutes. He shrugged, as if to say luck was on his side. Meanwhile, Bruno growled, ears pinned. I gently patted him on the back of the neck, though he wouldn't settle. Elias, for his part, didn't seem bothered by the dog's aggression. He just smiled at Bruno. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked me. I told him I was from the D.C. area, up here to clear my head. He nodded sympathetically. I asked if he'd seen any other hikers or if he had a working phone or GPS. He tapped his own phone. Died on me yesterday, hasn't taken a charge since. The conversation felt oddly comfortable on the surface, but something about Elias kept the hair on my neck standing up. He was just too crisp, like he was stepping out of an LL Bean catalog rather than a forest that had been messing with me since dawn. Still, having another person around did ease some of my fear. We shared some of my beef jerky and a canteen of water. Though he claimed he wasn't thirsty, the sun slipped away entirely, and we had only the dancing firelight. At one point, Bruno went out of sight. I whistled, but he didn't come. That was unusual. Elias simply said, "He's probably investigating a scent, might be back by morning." I tried to ignore how odd it was for my dog to vanish like that, but my anxiety kept rising. I half rose to search for him. Elias patted the log next to him, urging me to stay. His voice was calm, reassuring, and I found myself sitting again, the energy drained out of me. We talked until late, though I don't remember exactly what was said. My mind felt foggy. He seemed to know things about me, where I worked, the fact that I was recently single. I must have let some details slip, but I couldn't remember telling him. When I asked questions about him, he answered vaguely, "Just drifting, place to place. I go wherever I'm needed." I finally slipped into my tent, exhausted. As I dozed, I heard Elias humming outside in a low baritone. It was an old tune, something that made me feel even more unsettled. I slept fitfully. I swear at one point I heard Bruno barking in the distance, multiple barks from multiple directions. Then I heard Elias's calm voice echo, "He's fine, Ryan. Go to sleep." When I woke in the morning, Elias was gone, and Bruno was not there either. I immediately went into a panic, calling for my dog at the top of my lungs, scouring the edges of the clearing. There wasn't a single track except my own footprints. The fire pit was cold. Had it all been a dream? The strangest part, the date on my watch read October 9th, the same date as yesterday. That had to be a glitch. My watch was analog, though. No electronics, just gears. It was ticking, but the date window hadn't changed. Frustrated and worried, I put on my pack and scoured the area for clues. The day was overcast, giving everything a bleak cast. The deeper I went into the woods, the more lost I felt. The trees twisted in ways I couldn't recall from the day before. Some trunks had deep scars that looked fresh, as though slashed by a giant claw. Then I found Bruno, limping back toward me, eyes bloodshot, muzzle dark with something that might have been blood or mud. He didn't bark or whine in greeting, just stared at me like he wasn't sure who I was. When I crouched to examine him, he showed no obvious wounds but flinched away. My relief was short-lived because something about him seemed off. I tried to feed him a piece of jerky, but he just sniffed and turned his head. Bruno normally inhaled any snack, but now he almost recoiled. He did follow me, though, at a short distance, like he was half afraid, half aggressive. That afternoon, everything went from bad to worse. The sun, which I expected to set around 6:30 or 7 o'clock, vanished behind the hills at 5 o'clock. In less than an hour, it was dark as midnight. My watch now read October 8th. It was moving backward. My mind reeled, telling me it had to be broken. That was the only possible explanation, except I'd never had a watch run in reverse before, let alone one that displayed the wrong date. I tried building another fire, but the matches wouldn't strike. I used my flint and steel, but the sparks died in the damp tinder. I was about to give up when Elias reappeared, practically materializing out of the trees like a phantom. He had an expression of mild concern on his face, but that hint of a grin still lingered around his lips. "Let me help you," he said. One strike of his match and the flames roared to life. I stepped back, goosebumps prickling my skin. "How are you doing that?" I tried for half an hour. His reply was cryptic. "Some fires only answer to certain hands." Bruno growled at him, but then lay down, his muzzle on his paws. Elias reached out, and Bruno didn't snap, just whined. That whine sounded almost human. I mustered up some courage. "Where did you go this morning? My dog was gone too." He shrugged. "Looking for a way out of this place. Didn't you find it?" The frustration boiled over. No, of course I didn't. Every trail leads in circles. My map is useless, my phone is dead, my dog is acting strange, my watch is... Elias held up a hand, silencing me. "I know. There's something special about these woods. They've been waiting for someone like you." That made no sense, but his tone was friendly, calm, too calm, given the nightmares swirling around us. My mind wrestled with possibilities. Was this man a trickster? A criminal? A con artist? Or was I losing my grip on sanity? We passed the evening in tense silence, except for the crackle of flames and Bruno's occasional whines. Elias just sat there, gazing into the fire, humming again under his breath. I caught glimpses of his face in the firelight. Not a bead of sweat, not a single smudge of ash. I resolved that night to get out on my own. I had enough supplies for 2 more days, maybe 3 if I rationed. If I needed to, I'd keep going until I found a road or a ranger station. As I drifted to sleep, I heard the forest crackle and shift around me, like the trees were creeping forward centimeter by centimeter. The next morning, Elias was once again gone, and Bruno was nowhere to be seen. I rushed around the campsite, calling Bruno's name until my voice turned hoarse, telling myself, he's old, but he's tough. He can survive, just find him. I moved in the direction the sun should have been rising, only it felt like midday half an hour later. The light soared overhead, too bright, then abruptly softened to near dusk. My stomach churned. Time was slipping. I tied a piece of paracord around my left wrist, yanking it tight as a reminder to keep myself grounded. If nothing else, the pain would help me remember I was still real. When I spotted a shape in the distance, 4 legs, a tail, I sprinted toward it. Bruno! But it wasn't Bruno, it was a deer, half decomposed, staggering on limbs that looked broken. Flies buzzed around its open wounds. It looked at me with wide, milky eyes, then collapsed in a heap. By the time I reached it, the body was rotted almost to the bone, as if it had died years ago. I reeled back in horror, retching. The forest stank of decay. I had to keep moving or I'd lose my mind. About an hour later, I found Bruno. This time, definitely him. He was lying in some ferns, covered in dirt, eyes half-lidded. At first, I thought he was dead, but when I carefully touched his side, I felt a faint rise and fall. Relief flooded me. I gave him water, which he lapped slowly, then I coaxed him to stand. He didn't wag his tail or bark, but he followed me. That was enough for the moment. I continued searching for a trail marker, a sign, anything. That's when the ground began to slope downward, and I caught sight of a man-made structure. It looked like a small stone fire ring with logs arranged inside. The exact same arrangement I'd seen 2 nights before. Had I circled back? I cursed under my breath. I'd tried going straight in one direction, yet ended up in the same clearing. The desperation was overwhelming. My heart hammered so loudly I could feel the pulse in my temples. Just then, a heavy hush fell over the forest. No rustling leaves, no bird calls, nothing. Bruno's ears perked, and he let out a sharp bark. Then the brush parted, and Elias stepped through. He wore a sympathetic smile as if sensing my panic. "You look exhausted, Ryan. Let me take your pack." I recoiled. "Get the hell away from me. I don't know what's happening, but you're in on it." He gave me a slow nod. "That's fair. You're upset. This place can do that to you." "No," I snapped. "You're doing it. You or some group out here. Are you messing with me, driving me insane?" Elias shrugged. "Maybe I'm helping you along. Maybe the forest brought us both here. Does it matter?" I lost it. I lunged, swinging a fist at him. I'm not a fighter, but I wanted to connect, to knock that smug expression off his face. My punch felt like it went through water, landing somewhere behind him. My body pitched forward, toppling to the ground. Elias let out a soft laugh. "Don't waste your strength," he said. "We still have a long way to go." I glared up at him, chest heaving. He crouched, placed a hand on my shoulder. I swear it felt ice cold, not warm like a human hand. "Ryan, I know you're hurting, but this can end quickly if you want it to. Just say the word and all your burdens disappear." I pushed myself away from him. My mind was reeling with fear, confusion, anger. My watch. October 7 now, 2 days behind the date we started. The second hand ticked backward in short, jerky motions. Elias's voice lowered. "Otherwise, you'll keep going in circles until you can't stand. The forest has claimed countless souls. Maybe it's time you join them." I felt a surge of nausea. At that moment, Bruno stepped between us, teeth bared. Elias frowned. "Seems your dog still has some fight in him." Then he stepped back into the trees, as if beckoned by some invisible signal. I heard him whisper, "I'll be around, don't worry." Moments later, he was gone, leaving the forest silent. I broke then, tears burning my eyes. This was no ordinary wilderness mishap or even a cult scenario. It felt like I'd walked into another plane of existence, or a place where the rules of reality had dissolved. The weight of it crushed my spirit. Bruno nudged me with his muzzle, whining. That small gesture gave me something to hold on to. I patted his head, and his tail gave a weak wag. So maybe he wasn't entirely changed. I tried to set up camp again, though every fiber in me wanted to keep moving. I forced myself to eat some jerky, offered Bruno some as well. Then I pulled out a small pot to boil water from a stream. That's when I noticed my supplies. My freeze-dried meals looked moldy. Green fuzz clung to the insides of the packets. My trail mix had worms wriggling in it. A day ago, all of that was perfectly fine. I almost vomited again, but kept it together. I decided to do without the prepared food. I still had some granola bars sealed tight in plastic. They were the only safe thing I could find. I gave half a bar to Bruno and he ate, albeit slowly. Night fell fast. I tried to stay awake by the fire. Somehow, it stayed lit now, like it had decided to keep burning without Elias's help. But I drifted off anyway, lulled by sheer exhaustion. I had a nightmare of being in a burning church. Elias stood at the altar, wearing a twisted grin, telling me I had no name unless I gave it to him. Then Bruno barked, and the walls collapsed into embers. I woke to shrieking. Bruno was gone. I bolted upright, panic seizing me. The fire was out. Dawn was nowhere in sight. The watch read October 6th. My flashlight flickered, revealing fresh boot prints in the mud. Could they be Elias's? Terror guided me. I sprinted into the darkness, calling for Bruno, following the muffled whines echoing somewhere among the trees. Twigs and branches clawed at my arms and face. My foot caught on a root, and I tumbled headlong into a shallow creek, the cold water shocking me into hyper-awareness. On the far bank, I saw movement. Bruno's silhouette trembling. He lay beneath a figure. Someone crouched over him. My heart nearly stopped. I aimed the flashlight, but it sputtered and died. In that brief flash, I saw a pale face with half of its flesh stripped away. revealing blackened bone. It might have been Elias, or it might have been something else. Bruno let out a blood-chilling yelp, then went silent. "No!" I screamed. I scrambled forward only to trip on a rock and slam my knee. Pain flared. By the time I stood again, the figure was gone, and Bruno's body was lying motionless in the mud. My breath caught in my throat. I knelt beside him, shining the flickering light across his fur. The side of his neck was slashed open. Blood soaked into the earth, turning the water crimson. He was still breathing, so faintly it tore at my heart. "Bruno," I whispered, tears hot on my cheeks. "Hang on, boy." He twitched, eyes rolling. In the faint glow, I saw something impossible. His eyes flicked black, then white, then black again. He snarled. At me. He tried to stand, foam gathering at his jaws. I pinned him gently. It was no use. He was in agony, and something else was happening behind those eyes, like a malevolent presence staring back at me. He lunged, snapping at my arm. I cried out, pushing him away, tears streaming. This was not my dog. Or at least, not just my dog anymore. He coughed once, and an awful sound came from his throat, like a human voice trying to speak. Then he collapsed. His chest rose once more, and then stopped. I pressed my ear to his side, listening for a heartbeat I knew wouldn't be there. I stayed like that for a minute or an hour. Time meant nothing out here. Eventually, I let out a raw scream that tore at my throat. Something rustled nearby. I spun to see Elias emerging from the darkness. His face was intact again, his smile mild. "He served his purpose," Elias said softly. "He led you to the place you needed to be. Now you can focus on—" I cut him off, fury giving me strength I never knew I had. I grabbed a tent stake from my pack, brandishing it like a knife. "You did this," I snarled, tears still burning my eyes. "I'll kill you." Elias stepped forward, unconcerned. "Ryan, I'm giving you a way out. Just let go of your fear. Release your—" I lunged, driving the stake at his chest. At the last second, he twisted, and I slashed his face instead. His skin sizzled on contact, emitting a smell like sulfur and brimstone. He let out a roar, not quite human, and reeled back. "You'll regret that," he hissed, voice now layered with something else, like multiple voices speaking in unison. I wanted to make this simple. With a speed I couldn't track, he backhanded me, sending me sprawling into the wet leaves. My vision blurred. I crawled to Bruno's lifeless body, choking back sobs. Elias stood over me, half his face burned away, revealing an ashen skeleton beneath. Wisps of black smoke rose from the wound. The forest echoed with his ragged breath. "Hold on to your precious name then, Ryan Carter," he said, each word vibrating with low fury. "We'll see what's left of you by sunrise." A wave of darkness surged in my head, and I blacked out. I woke at a guess of dawn. My watch read October 5th. Bruno's body was still next to me, stiff and cold. Flies had already gathered. Heart hammering, I gently closed his eyes. I wanted to bury him, but I had no shovel, and the ground was stony. Every attempt to dig with my hands broke my fingernails and bloodied my knuckles. Finally, I covered him with rocks, forming a crude cairn by the creek. My tears wouldn't stop, grief blending into rage. Something had changed in me after that. Fear and sadness coalesced into defiance. If I was going to die out here, I'd go down fighting. I tore strips of cloth from my spare shirt, bandaged my bleeding knuckles, and marched forward, not knowing or caring which direction. Time had no meaning. My watch's hands spun in slow circles, reversing every so often. The sun rose and fell with no pattern. My phone was a dead hunk of plastic. My food supply was rotting. My water tasted metallic. And still, the forest bent itself into loops, funneling me back to that same clearing with the stone fire ring. Every time I arrived, the ring looked older or newer, as though it was stuck in a shifting timeline. At some point, call it day 5, day 50, I couldn't keep track. I ended up at the clearing again, stumbling with exhaustion. My nails were filthy, my arms scratched raw by briars. My lips were cracked from dehydration, and I'd started hearing voices in the wind. Elias sat by the unlit fire ring, face mended somehow, wearing the same calm grin. He gestured to a canteen. "Care for a drink?" he asked. I eyed him warily. My throat burned with thirst, but I remembered what he'd done. "I'll pass," I rasped. He shrugged. "It might buy you time. This forest has many hungry shadows." I stepped closer, the stake in my hand. "Who? What are you?" He tilted his head as if considering the question. "Some call me a devil, some call me the caretaker here. In your language, maybe I'm both." "Why me?" He smirked. "You walked in willingly. You practically offered yourself up, all that guilt and heartbreak weighing you down. I just helped guide you to your rightful path." I spat at the ground. "You killed my dog." His expression was unchanging, serene. "The forest took him. I only used him to show you the way. One life in exchange for your eternal devotion." I snapped. I swung the stake at him, fueled by sheer hatred. He blocked with an impossible speed, gripping my wrist. I felt my bones grind under his inhuman strength. Then something inside me flared, my battered, desperate will. I spun, yanking free, and smashed the cast-iron cooking pot, which I'd carried strapped to my pack, against the side of his head. He roared, a terrifying, multi-layered sound that reverberated in my skull. A black fluid oozed from where the pot struck him, steaming as it hit the ground. He tried to stand, but I slammed the pot again, pressing it to his face, the metal scorching his flesh. A smell like rotting eggs and burning hair filled the air. Elias convulsed. His eyes flared crimson, and his grin twisted into something monstrous. He let out a piercing shriek that felt like it would tear the sky open. "I'll tear out your soul," he spat, voice distorted. "You think you can escape me? This forest is me." My entire body shook with adrenaline. I forced the pot harder against him, ignoring the spatter of hot black fluid on my arms. I half expected him to crumble to ash. Instead, he lurched to his feet, sending me stumbling back. His face was partially caved in, wisps of smoky darkness swirling where bone should be. And still he advanced. My knees threatened to buckle. Then I remembered the paracord around my wrist. I grabbed it, yanked a length free, and looped it around a nearby trunk in a last-ditch attempt at I don't know what. All I knew was I needed to hold on to something real, some anchor. He lunged, but in that moment the forest seemed to groan. A gust of wind whipped the leaves around us. I felt a jolt, like the entire world shift underfoot. Elias froze, eyes wild. The paracord, smeared with my blood and tears, glowed faintly in the gloom. I staggered away, heart pounding. Elias reached for me, but something in the forest pulled him back, as though invisible roots were binding him. "You can't leave, Ryan Carter," he snarled, voice trembling with rage. "You belong to me." I didn't respond. My brain screamed only one word: run. So I did. I bolted away, not caring about direction. I heard him bellow behind me, felt the ground quake. My legs hammered against the earth until my lungs burned. The forest flickered from day to night and back again. The trees loomed impossibly tall, or sometimes seemed to shrink. If I looked up, the sky whirled with swirling clouds that spun clockwise, then counterclockwise. But I kept running, ignoring my battered limbs and throbbing head. After some indefinite span of terror, I burst through the tree line onto a dirt road. It was so sudden I nearly tumbled into the ditch. The forest ended in a sharp line behind me. I blinked in confusion, turning to look back. The trees had rearranged themselves into a neat border. No sign of Elias, no sign of any unearthly glow. My watch froze at October 4th. The wind carried a faint whisper. Ryan. I forced myself to face forward, scanning the road. It looked real, tangible, a normal country path. In the distance, I saw a battered Green Ranger truck trundling toward me. Relief flooded my chest, though a tremor of dread still clung. I waved both arms, stumbling into the middle of the road. The truck slowed, a man in a ranger uniform leaning out the window. He was older, grizzled, with crow's feet around his eyes. "You all right?" he called. I tried to speak but found only a croak. He hopped out, helped me into the passenger seat. Up close he smelled of coffee and tobacco, which grounded me a bit. "Let's get you to a hospital," he muttered, rummaging for a first aid kit. "You're banged up bad." I sat there, trembling, not even sure if I could handle a conversation. My mind reeled with the memory of everything I'd seen. My dog was dead. Elias, whatever he was, still out there. Could he follow me? The ranger started the truck, heading along the dirt road. "You know your name?" I swallowed. "Ryan Carter." He nodded. "Where'd you come from?" Savage River State Forest." His brow furrowed. "That's a ways out, and not near any direct road here, you sure?" I just nodded. My eyes flicked to his name badge. Tom Wilson. I told myself he was real. He had to be. We drove in silence for about 10 minutes, or an hour, or maybe just a heartbeat. Time wasn't making sense to me, but the truck rumbled steadily under my feet, the engine humming a comforting tune. I stared out the window, watching the forest pass by. Normal forest, or so it seemed. At some point, Ranger Wilson tried the radio to call in a found hiker. The radio crackled, then fell silent. He cursed softly, "This old piece of junk." I began to drift, exhaustion finally claiming me. My body ached from top to bottom, and my vision blurred. When I turned to look at the ranger, he was watching me with an odd expression. "What is it?" I asked, voice quivering. He gave me a small, tight smile. "Just rest. We'll get you sorted out." But something in his eyes made my skin crawl. It was that unwavering stare, that slightly too intense smile. A flicker of familiarity. Could I trust him? I forced myself to look away, focusing on the dusty dashboard. Before long, I must have passed out from sheer exhaustion. When I blinked awake, we were at a small ranger station. A squat building with a wooden sign. Monroe Ranger Outpost. Ranger Wilson was nowhere to be seen. The engine was off, keys in the ignition. I slowly climbed out of the truck, legs shaking. The station door was ajar, a single light glowing inside. "Hello?" I called. No answer. I stepped in, the floorboards creaking underfoot. A desk sat in the center of the room, empty. On the wall behind it was a map of Savage River State Forest, old and yellowed. My heart pounded as I approached. A bright red marker circled an area labeled Monroe's Run Trail, closed. Handwritten in the margins. "Danger. Do not enter. Multiple unsolved disappearances." The hair on my arms stood up. The station smelled of stale coffee and dust, as though it hadn't been used in years. I turned to see a door labeled Private. It was slightly open. Light spilled out from within. Gently, I pushed it open, half expecting to see Ranger Wilson or some normal sign of life. Instead, I found an empty cot, dusty blankets, and a single old photograph pinned to the wall. It was black and white. A date scrawled at the bottom, 1953. A group of rangers in old-fashioned uniforms stood in front of a battered truck. my breath caught. The man on the far left looked just like Ranger Tom Wilson. Same face, only the photo was 70 years old. My stomach lurched. I staggered back, noticing more details. The wallpaper peeling, the musty smell of disuse. This station hadn't been active in decades, which meant I rushed out to the truck, thrown into a panic. My mind screamed that I was still trapped, that maybe I'd never left the loop. But the truck was there, real enough, though the paint was chipped and peeling, the tires caked in mud, the windows so dusty it seemed it had been abandoned for a long time. Had I hallucinated the ride? Or had time slipped again? My watch hand spun in circles, useless. Then I heard a bark. For a moment my heart soared. Bruno? But Bruno was dead. I forced myself to remember that. Another bark came from behind the station. I stepped around the side, half hoping, half terrified. A German shepherd stepped out of the trees. Its eyes glowed faintly. I recognized the pattern of fur, the shape of the ears. It was Bruno, or a perfect copy. He stared at me, tail raised but not wagging. "Bruno?" I whispered, tears forming. He padded forward. In the pale light, his muzzle gleamed wet and dark. My breath caught. As he moved closer, I saw the slash in his neck was gone, replaced by a faint scar. His eyes flicked from brown to black. Trembling, I backed away, whispering, "No, you can't be real." He opened his jaws and spoke. Not in a dog's bark or whine, but in Elias's voice. "You found your way back to me. You can't escape this place." I screamed. The dog's lips curled into a too-human smile, then lunged. I instinctively raised my arm. Its teeth sank into the flesh just above my elbow, ripping through my jacket. Pain exploded in my brain, bright and nauseating. Desperate, I swung my other arm with the stake I'd never let go of. The point drove into the dog's side, eliciting a yelp that morphed into a guttural hiss. The creature recoiled, pulling free, flecks of my blood spraying the ground. Its form shimmered, half dog, half Elias, a demonic amalgamation. Summoning every scrap of will, I drove the stake again, hitting its flank. It collapsed briefly, letting out an unearthly shriek that rattled the windows of the station. Then, with a snap, it vanished in a swirl of leaves. I was left panting, clutching my bleeding arm. I stumbled back into the ranger station, sinking onto the floor. My vision swam from pain and blood loss. I tried to slow the bleeding with the remains of my jacket. Time lost meaning. I sat there, half delirious, waiting for dawn or rescue or some final doom. The walls seemed to shift. The map on the wall warping in my peripheral vision to read "Carter's Loop" in big red letters. I closed my eyes, whispering, "I won't give you my name, you bastard." The night stretched on. I might have passed out multiple times. Each time I woke, I expected Elias to appear, or the dog version of him. Instead, as the first rays of light crept through the filthy windows, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A real truck? I forced myself up, ignoring the pain in my arm. Peeking out, I saw a battered pickup, definitely more modern than 1953. A man in a baseball cap stood next to it, talking on a cell phone. Hope crashed over me. I burst out of the station, staggering toward him. He turned, startled. "What the? Are you okay?" My voice cracked. "Hospital, please." He rushed forward, helping me into his truck. His phone was pressed to his ear, calling 911, describing my condition, saying, "I'm at the Old Monroe Ranger outpost." "Yeah, the one that's been shut down for decades." "I know, I just found him here." He gave me water. It tasted real, fresh, no metallic tang. I gulped it down, tears streaking my face. His voice sounded normal, frantic in a human way. Then we sped off down a dirt road. My eyelids drooped. The last thing I remember was him telling the operator my name, Ryan Carter, and requesting an ambulance. That was over a week ago. The doctors say I was found in shock, with severe dehydration and a nasty bite wound that looked more like an animal attack than anything else. They pumped me full of antibiotics, sewed up my arm, kept me under observation in a small hospital near Frostburg. When the police asked me questions, I told them the bare minimum. I got lost in Savage River State Forest. My dog died from a wild animal attack. I ended up at an abandoned ranger station. I didn't mention Elias, or the time loops, or any of the other horrifying events. I could see the skepticism in their eyes even with my half-truths. They wouldn't believe the real story. The strangest thing is, I can't find any official records of a ranger, Tom Wilson, who served in that area. But there are old photographs in the local library's archives that show a man of the same name from the 1950s. No death date listed, just a missing persons note from 1956. A couple of days ago, I left the hospital. My arm is bandaged, but healing. Physically, I'll be fine. The mental scars are another matter. When I returned to my apartment, I discovered a small clay jar on my kitchen counter, something I'd never seen before. Inside it was a handful of ashes and scraps of cloth that looked like part of my dog's collar. I can't explain how that jar got there. My front door was locked, and no one had the key. But that night I dreamt of Elias's voice. Don't forget whose name you carry. We're never done. Every attempt to rid myself of the jar has failed. I've thrown it in the trash, only to find it again on the counter the next morning. I smashed it once, but it reappeared intact after I woke from a nightmare. So here I am, writing this down, hoping to exorcise the memories or at least make sense of them. The forest might still have a hold on me, or maybe I'm free and just haunted by guilt. The docs say I might have PTSD, that my mind is conflating real events with hallucinations. But I know the truth. I've felt the heat of a demonic presence, heard the wind carry my name in a place where time means nothing, and watched my loyal companion twist into something else. I can't bury that knowledge. It's a brand on my soul. Elias, the devil, a caretaker, call him what you will, told me I was never leaving. Yet here I sit, outside those cursed woods. But there's an emptiness in my gut, a sense that the forest isn't done with me. Sometimes I hear Bruno's bark in the dead of night, or the ring of matches striking behind my apartment walls. I don't dare go near forests or even parks now. I jerk awake at any strange sound, expecting to see that half-rotted grin and those blazing red eyes. And every morning, my watch resets itself to October 4th. It's a cheap analog watch, so maybe it's just broken from the ordeal. But I can't bring myself to remove it. In the darkest hours, I swear I see the hands spinning backward, counting down to something. Maybe to the moment the loop reopens, calling me back. If that happens, I'll be ready. I have a small arsenal in my apartment. Knives, a camp stove, a new dog, a puppy named Max. Though sometimes I glance at him and imagine his eyes glinting red just for a moment. My heart seizes in fear, and I have to look away. I'm still Ryan Carter, still 31 years old, still clinging to the reality that I survived. But what I survived defies every law of nature I thought unbreakable. The forest taught me one thing. You can run, but you can't escape what's already under your skin. So, if you ever find yourself near Monroe Run Trail in Savage River State Forest, do me a favor. Turn around, go home. Don't tempt whatever roams those woods, because once you set foot in there, you might never leave. And if by some miracle you do, you'll wish you hadn't. That's all I can say. This happened in October 2023, and even as I finish writing, the lights flicker, the air smells faintly of sulfur, and my watch reads October 3rd. I can sense him, Elias, somewhere out there, or maybe right behind me. I won't give him my name. I won't surrender what's left of my soul. But God help me if the forest comes calling again. My name is Eric Dawson. I'm 33 years old, and this happened in October of 2023. If you ever find yourself tired of city life and thinking about retreating to the woods to live off the grid, maybe my story will make you think again. I certainly wish someone had told me these horrors before I ever set foot in Savage River State Forest. I'd bought my little patch of land near a place called St. John's Rock in western Maryland, deep in the heart of Savage River State Forest. The place was named well. It was about as savage as any wilderness I'd ever seen. I'd come out here alone, not because I was particularly skilled at off-grid living, but because the city, Baltimore, had turned on me. Or maybe I had turned on it. Doesn't matter anymore. I had grown weary of those digital jobs where you spend hours behind a computer screen, anxious about whether your internet might drop in the middle of a client call. I was a freelance web designer by trade, and the solitude of the forest called to me like some holy promise. No deadlines, no never-ending honks of traffic, no glaring neon signs, just silence, a place I could exist in. I wasn't a survival expert, I'd had no special training, and certainly wasn't a veteran or anything like that. But I did my research, I read books on minimalism and bushcraft, watched an infinite number of YouTube videos about building your own cabin, gathering water, and living off the land. That was enough to make me think I could do it. My plan was simple. I had enough savings to build a small, off-grid cabin. I'd fish, gather wood, maybe grow some vegetables in a raised bed. I'd take it easy. Maybe write a blog about it, Eric's Off-Grid Adventure. Though, ironically, that'd require an internet connection. But I'd figure out details later. I brought my dog, Rusty, with me. A good-natured mutt of uncertain breed, part lab, part shepherd, part something else. He was a big boy, black and tan with a friendly bark and an uncanny ability to sense danger. That's how we ended up in a half-built cabin, with no electricity other than a small solar rig on the roof in the middle of the woods. It started off peaceful enough. The cabin was a rough structure of timber and plywood, still smelling of fresh-cut lumber. I had no neighbors within 2 miles, though I'd heard rumors that some folks lived off-grid nearby. I'd only glimpsed them from afar, a figure walking through the brush or the flicker of a campfire down the hill. But that was all. By day, the forest was a dream. Tall pines, a crisp breeze, the chatter of squirrels and chipmunks rustling leaves. The sound of the river a half-mile away, water tumbling over rocks and pleasant music. Even if there was a chill in the air, it felt good to be away from the screech of city life. But at night, the world changed. There was an unsettling silence, too quiet, too abrupt. I expected normal forest noises, owls hooting, insects chirring, maybe the scurrying of a fox. But sometimes, after midnight, it was like the forest held its breath. Rusty noticed it first. His ears pricked up, and he'd stare into the trees, hackles raised. I'd follow his gaze, squinting in the darkness and see nothing. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it's just that I wasn't used to real wilderness. Maybe the forest is quiet in October, but Rusty refused to settle. He was normally eager to cuddle up in the corner by my sleeping bag, but every night he chose to stand guard by the door. Occasionally, I heard him do that low, rumbling growl that made the hair on my arms stand up. I kept telling myself it was just an animal, a raccoon, a deer. Something so mundane that I should have felt embarrassed to be afraid. But fear has a way of digging into your bones, lodging there. Especially once the weirdness began. It was a Tuesday, 2 weeks after I'd settled in. A crisp dawn, the temperature near freezing. I decided to gather more firewood. I'd chopped through my supply too quickly, underestimating how much wood a single person might need. I had a GPS handheld device because phone signals out here were practically non-existent. I pinned my cabin's location and wandered maybe half a mile from it. Along the way, I found evidence of something disturbing. A deer carcass, torn apart as if by a large predator. But it wasn't just that it had been eaten. The remains were arranged in a deliberate pattern. The entrails had been slung over a low branch, the legs placed upright in the ground as though someone had hammered them in. I gagged. The tang of blood and rot thick in the air. Rusty whined, sniffing at the edge, and refused to come any closer. It was the first real sign that something might be terribly wrong, but I still tried to rationalize. Maybe a bear or a bobcat had done it, though I'd never heard of them arranging kills like that. Or maybe some sick, twisted human was messing around. The next day, I'd put it out of my mind and kept working on reinforcing my cabin for winter. Naive, I know. But that night, as I prepared to make a small campfire outside, the wind shifted. It smelled like rotting meat again, and the smoke from my fire turned an odd, greenish hue. At first, I thought maybe it was the type of wood I'd used, but Rusty barked at the flames, the hackles on his back raised. And as I stared, there was a second or two where the fire seemed to flicker out of sync, almost moving backward, then forward again, like a glitch in a video. It happened so fast I thought it had to be a trick of the light, or maybe just my overactive imagination. But in those seconds, the entire forest felt off. I swear, the chirping cicadas or crickets froze. Everything just paused. And that was the first time I thought, something is messing with time. The day after, I finally met Mitch Branner. He popped up out of nowhere in the late morning, walking softly through the trees. I had my guard raised, because out here if you see someone, they might not necessarily be a friend. But Mitch smiled. An easy, crooked smile. He was in his early 40s, with a sun-beaten face, a scruffy beard, and a strong, wiry build. "Afternoon," he said. "Didn't mean to startle you." Rusty barked, but then grew quiet. I studied Mitch's eyes. They didn't look unhinged or threatening. If anything, he seemed polite in a subdued way. He told me he'd once been a forest ranger and had retired out here. Said he was living about 2 miles away, near a place the locals called Mossy Ridge. We talked about my cabin, about fishing. I was nervous, but relieved to have contact with another human who seemed normal. I did mention, hesitantly, the weird occurrences. The deer carcass, the green flames, how I felt time was off sometimes. Mitch listened, nodding, rubbing his chin. Then he asked if I'd seen anything tall at night, or heard whispers that sounded like they came from the treetops. I paused. I hadn't heard anything specific, but there'd been that sense of being watched. He let out a sigh. "Well," he said, "the forest here's old. Older than anything we can imagine. Strange stuff happens. If it gets too weird, maybe think of heading back to the city. This land can be unforgiving." It felt like a warning, but I was stubborn. I told him I appreciated the concern and I'd be careful. I didn't realize I was burying my head in the sand. A few nights later, I woke to Rusty barking frantically, his voice echoing among the trees. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped my sleeping bag, and stepped outside. A thick, chilly fog coated the clearing, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet. I called Rusty's name, heart hammering. He was near the edge of the woods, barking at something in the dark. Then he took off, disappearing among the trunks. Shouting after him, I stumbled through the undergrowth, branches scratching my arms. The flashlight's beam kept bouncing, illuminating wet leaves and gnarled roots. Eventually, I found him. He stood, ears flattened, snarling at a massive pine tree. The bark was drenched in a thick dark fluid that shimmered oddly under my flashlight. It looked like blood. There was no smell, though, no stench of decay. I reached out to touch it, and it was warm to the touch, sticky. My stomach clenched. That's when I heard scratching. It came from somewhere high above, so distant I thought it might be the branches in the wind. Then the entire trunk shook, sending a cascade of pine needles to the ground. Rusty barked again, but then cowered behind me. I didn't see whatever it was, but I heard it leap away from the upper branches, a dull thud as something heavy hit another tree, then silence. We were alone again, cold, breath steaming, my heart about to burst. Rusty and I sprinted back to the cabin. Once inside, I bolted the door, every rational part of me screaming that I should leave. But leave to where? My truck was parked 3 miles east, near the main dirt road, and this was the middle of the night with thick fog. Plus, I had pride. This was my place, right? I stayed awake, rifle in hand, until sunrise. In the following days, everything got worse. My phone, which barely worked to begin with, died. It wouldn't even turn on, as if the battery was fried. My handheld GPS started glitching. The screen flickered. The compass spun like it was magnetized in all the wrong ways. Paper maps I had pinned to a corkboard in the cabin suddenly didn't match the terrain. Trails looped where there had been no loops before. It made no sense. I tried to keep my mind busy. I fished at the river and, for a while, that helped. I actually caught 2 trout the first time. But on the second fishing trip, as dusk fell, I lost track of time in a terrifying way. I glanced down at my watch. It read 6:15 p.m. I walked maybe 100 yards back toward the cabin. When I checked again, the watch said 10:43 p.m. The sky was fully dark, and I had no recollection of those missing hours. Just gone. I was near frantic when I got back, but there was something else waiting there. Sitting on the front stoop of my cabin was a woman, dark-haired, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. She looked up, startled to see me, clutching a battered axe. She quickly got to her feet, backing away as though expecting me to yell at her. "Who the hell are you?" I asked, adrenaline still pumping from the lost time. She exhaled in relief. "Oh, thank God," she said. "I was starting to think nobody lived here. My name's Sadie Meeks." She explained she was a survival YouTuber, filming a series on off-grid life. She'd hiked into Savage River but gotten lost. Claimed she'd spent 3 days wandering in circles, though she only remembered setting out yesterday. Now she found my cabin and decided it was safer to wait there than keep moving in the dark. I believed her, if only because she had that haggard, haunted look I'd begun to see in my own reflection. Her eyes darted around like she was constantly expecting something to jump out of the trees. Rusty didn't bark at her, which I took as a good sign. That night, I made a small fire in the old steel drum I used as a makeshift stove, and we shared fish, mine from earlier, and some freeze-dried rations I had. She had a lot of questions about weird happenings. Had I heard voices? Was I losing days? Did the forest feel like it was warping or something? She was blunt, even aggressive about it. But I could see it was just fear. Yes, I told her, everything about this place seemed to be unraveling. Sadie decided to stay a while, at least until she could get her bearings. For a short time, it helped my sanity to have another human presence. We talked about city life, her YouTube channel. She told me she had about 100,000 subscribers who liked her confident, cocky brand of survival. Now, in the actual savage wilderness, she was having second thoughts about that confidence. 2 days later, Mitch reappeared. He strolled up in the late morning, apparently just out for a walk, and found Sadie and me chopping wood in the clearing. I introduced them, noticing Sadie's eyes narrow at him. Mitch gave his usual crooked smile, polite enough. Yet from the moment they met, the tension was thick. She didn't trust him, He offered us a few warnings about the local legends, mentioning Wendigo stories some folks told. He said he'd always brushed it off. This forest can spook you if you're not used to it. But at the same time, he gave Sadie a look that hinted he wasn't telling everything he knew. She shot me a sidelong glance as if to say, he's hiding something. I didn't know who or what to believe. On the one hand, Mitch's presence was somewhat comforting. He knew the land, had once been a ranger. On the other, the arranged deer carcass and the weird bloody pine tree suggested something monstrous or humanly cruel. And I had no illusions. People can be as monstrous as anything supernatural. Now that we had 3 people and a dog in my tiny cabin, it was crowded, but we managed. Nights were the worst. We tried to keep a fire going, but more often than not, it would die out without reason. Sometimes it burned with a flicker of green or blue. My supplies started showing mold or rot overnight. Canned goods I opened turned out spoiled, despite not being expired. Then came the night Rusty disappeared. We'd all been huddled around, telling stories under the dim lantern. It was close to midnight, that eerie hour. Suddenly, Rusty perked his head. He let out a low growl, as if hearing something we couldn't. Then he got up, walked straight to the door, nosed it, and whined. I said, "You need to go out, boy?" He just whined again. It seemed normal enough. I opened the door. He slipped outside. I grabbed a flashlight to watch him. He trotted about 10 paces into the dark, then froze. For a second, he turned to look at me. His eyes glowed with reflected light. Then he took off. Gone, vanished into the ink-black tree line. Sadie swore under her breath and grabbed her axe. Mitch offered to come with me to chase after Rusty, but I felt uneasy. The tension between him and Sadie, I wasn't sure I wanted them alone together, and I sure didn't want to lose my dog. In the end, I told them to stay put while I scoured the perimeter with the flashlight. Maybe I was gone for an hour, maybe longer. I screamed Rusty's name until my voice was hoarse. Tracked footprints in the mud, his paw prints, yes, but also weird elongated impressions, too large for any normal animal. Then I saw a single drop of dark red on the leaves. My heart seized. Blood? But no sign of Rusty. Eventually I returned to the cabin. "He'll come back," Sadie said quietly. And Mitch nodded, as if he'd seen this happen before. Rusty did come back, but not until dawn. Just after sunrise, I'd stepped outside, eyes bleary from nearly no sleep. Sadie was out there too, scanning the edge of the forest. Then I spotted a shape moving between the pines, slow and stiff, as though half frozen. "Rusty!" I cried, rushing toward him. I found him limping across the clearing. His fur was matted with mud or something black and sticky. Deep scratches ran across his flank. My heart soared that he was alive, but as soon as I got closer, I noticed something off in his expression. He wouldn't look me in the eye. His usually wagging tail hung limp. When I reached to pet him, he flinched away. I led him into the cabin, gently examining him for injuries. No obvious bite wounds, but the cuts looked nasty. There was an unsettling, acrid smell on his coat. He wouldn't let me touch his collar, and he refused food or water. From that moment on, Rusty was different. He'd stand in the corner of the cabin, head lowered, occasionally turning to stare at us with large, unblinking eyes. I've never seen a dog go that still. It unnerved Sadie so much, she refused to be alone with him. Mitch just shook his head, saying something about the forest taking what it wants. That was the day I began to sense something truly inhuman was at work in those woods. Shortly after Rusty returned, Mitch caught me outside alone. I was stacking wood that had somehow scattered in the night, like it had been thrown. He asked how long I planned to stay. I told him, "I'm not leaving my own property." He nodded slowly. "I get it, but sometimes you gotta cut and run." He paused, glancing around as if worried we were overheard by the trees themselves. "Eric, the land here, there's talk of a Wendigo." He said the word softly, as if it might conjure the beast just to speak it aloud. "I was a ranger a decade ago. There were missing persons cases, folks turning up, mutilated, or not at all." I asked what a Wendigo was, pretending not to know. "It's a creature from certain Native American legends, associated with cold, hunger, and endless appetite." He said the local version had a name, Ragjaw, that it might appear with antlers, or it might look human but wearing a deer skull or sometimes both at once. Hard to pin down. He also said the forest bent around it, that time itself got slippery in its domain. I demanded to know if he'd seen it. Mitch just shrugged. "I've seen something, heard screams, found tracks." Then he cautioned me to stay armed, to keep watch, to not venture out at night. I asked if we should call the authorities, but he snorted. "Cell reception's dead out here, right? You think troopers are coming this deep in the forest on a rumor of something that's not supposed to exist?" A cold dread pressed into my chest. "We have to warn Sadie," I said. "Sure," he replied, "but watch her too." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "You don't know her. She shows up with an axe and a weird story. She might be more dangerous than you think." I didn't know what to believe. Sadie didn't strike me as a killer, but I realized how little I really knew about her. Anxiety gnawed at my stomach. That evening, I got some alone time with Sadie after Mitch had wandered off to do something in the woods. We sat by a newly lit campfire, the only warmth in the gathering dusk. She shot me a worried glance. "Mitch creeps me out," she said quietly. "I've been checking around. You know he has no footprints around the cabin in the mornings, but he always shows up like he's been close by. He might be watching us." My mind reeled. Did I trust her or him? "He told me you might be dangerous," I admitted. She shook her head, scowling. "Of course he did. He's gaslighting you. I've seen guys like him, alone in the woods, reading weird books, maybe dabbling in something. You have to wonder how far gone he is." She tossed a stick into the flames, which sputtered and hissed in a greenish flicker. "Eric, there's something else. Look what I found by a stream." She pulled out a small Polaroid photo from her jacket pocket. The image was blurred, but I recognized a pile of bones arranged in a circular pattern. Deer bones, or maybe something else. "I think Mitch might have done this," she whispered. "Or maybe he's worshipping whatever monster roams these woods." I went cold. Could Mitch be luring in newcomers for some dark ritual? But I didn't have enough proof. Only fear and speculation. We talked in hushed tones about an escape plan, but neither of us wanted to set out at night, especially with the forest twisting time and space. We decided we'd try to gather supplies and leave at dawn. That same night, I woke again to Rusty's growling. This time, it was a low, continuous rumble. Sadie was sitting upright in her sleeping bag, her axe next to her. The cabin's single lantern flickered, casting weird moving shadows on the wall. "Where's Mitch?" she asked. I looked around. He'd been sleeping in a corner, but he was gone. The door stood ajar, letting in a cold draft. For a moment, we sat there, listening to Rusty's growl rise and fall. Then we heard a thump from outside, followed by a muffled moan. My instincts screamed at me not to go, but I did anyway. I grabbed my flashlight, rifle slung over my shoulder, and stepped out with Sadie behind me. A swirl of thick fog choked the clearing. Our flashlights cut meager cones of light through it. Another thump sounded, to our left, near the gnarled oak. When we got closer, we found Mitch. He was lying on his back, trembling. His eyes stared vacantly at the sky, half-lidded. A gaping wound on his neck pulsed, but no blood poured out. It looked dry, as if the blood had been sucked out or never existed. "Mitch!" I yelled, kneeling beside him. He let out a strangled breath and rolled his head toward me. "Gone. Took me," he rasped. "I lost me." That's all I could make out. Then he started laughing softly, a wet, disturbing noise. "The hunger chooses," he said in a trembling voice. "It takes the soft first." Sadie stood over him, breathing hard, axe in hand. She looked more terrified than I'd seen her before. "Eric, we need to get him inside." We lifted Mitch up, but to our horror, something cracked in his chest like snapping twigs. He jerked upright with an eerie strength, staring at me in the face, inches away, eyes wide. "The forest took me," he whispered, in a voice not his own. "Now, I take you." Then his eyes rolled back and he slumped unconscious. We half carried, half dragged him into the cabin. The door slammed behind us, though no wind was blowing. Rusty cowered in the corner, refusing to approach. Mitch's neck wound was terrifying, but despite what looked like mortal damage, he was still breathing. Shallow, rattling breaths. He was alive, but wrong. After we laid Mitch on a sleeping bag, Sadie rummaged in his pack, which he'd left by the door, for first aid supplies. But she found something else. Photographs. They showed brutally mutilated bodies in the forest. Male, female, even children. Some were pinned to trees, others arranged in circles. My stomach churned. At the bottom of the stack was a Polaroid of Mitch himself, smiling with a fresh kill. A deer, at least this time, but it looked half-flayed. Another shot showed him constructing a shrine of bones near a fallen log. Instantly, I remembered what Sadie had told me. He's worshipping something. But Mitch's eyes fluttered open, fixing on me. His grin spread too wide, as if his muscles were pulled by invisible hooks. "I am the voice of hunger," he muttered. "The forest demands blood." Then he seized Sadie's arm with surprising force, causing her to shriek. I wrestled him off, stepping back. Sadie was trembling, but her expression hardened. "He's possessed," she said in a quavering tone. "That's not Mitch anymore." We sat in paralyzed confusion for a moment, deciding what to do. Suddenly, a raspy bark came from Rusty. I looked over. He was arching his back, muzzle raised, teeth bared. For a heartbeat, I thought he was warning us about Mitch. Then Rusty lunged at Sadie. She screamed, bringing the axe up. The dog latched onto her forearm, drawing blood, a savage snarl echoing in the tiny space. For a second, I stood in shock, unsure how to intervene without risking Sadie's arm. She swung the axe handle, connecting with Rusty's ribs. He let go, leaping backward, saliva dripping from his jaws. "What the hell, Rusty?" I shouted, mind spinning. This was not my dog. This was some twisted husk that used to be him. Sadie, shaken, stared at the blood running down her arm. Then, with a wild light in her eyes, she lunged forward, bringing the axe down in a diagonal strike. Rusty tried to dodge, but it grazed his shoulder, letting out a sickening thud. I screamed, "No!" But it was too late. She raised the axe again. Rusty let out a guttural, undog-like sound almost like a human moan, and then he collapsed, twitching, blood pooling on the cabin floor. An enormous wave of grief and revulsion crashed over me. Rusty, my best friend, loyal companion, dead on my cabin floor. But my heartbreak warred with the knowledge that the creature attacking Sadie might no longer have been Rusty at all. Something had changed him, turned him savage. Still, the guilt was overwhelming. Sadie fell to her knees, sobbing, the axe still clenched in a white-knuckled grip. I looked to Mitch, expecting him to cackle or do something horrifying, but he'd slipped into unconsciousness again. In the aftermath, I lost track of time. We debated burying Rusty, but it was pitch black outside and it felt too dangerous. We cleaned up as best we could, stowing his body under a tarp by the door. A horrible hush filled the cabin. The lantern flame flickered erratically, making shadows lurch. It made me feel seasick. At some point, I realized I hadn't checked my watch. It read 3:02 a.m. I tried to breathe, calm myself. Then I got up to peek out the door at the sky, expecting stars or maybe the faint glow of dawn. But what I saw was full daylight. A bright sun shining through the treetops as if it were noon. How? I muttered, stepping outside, my eyes watering in the sudden brightness. Sadie stumbled out behind me, half blind from the light. "What time is it?" she asked. I held up my watch. It still said 3:02 a.m. Impossible. The sky was a brilliant blue. We looked around in confusion. The forest chirped with daytime activity, birds, squirrels, everything wide awake. I felt dizzy, as if I might pass out. We retreated into the cabin, blinking away the glare. But inside, Mitch was up, sitting cross-legged as if waiting for us. He stared at us with that unnatural grin, though his wound was still there, raw. He said, "Time is your enemy now. The forest is Ragjaw's domain." Then he stood up, coughed, and walked out the door without another word. Sadie and I exchanged a look of horror, but we were too stunned to stop him. We followed him outside, but the moment we passed the door frame, the sun was gone. It was night again, stars overhead, the forest silent. No sign of Mitch. We were alone. The cabin's open doorway looked black and foreboding behind us. My watch read 3:03 a.m. We tried sleeping. What else was there to do? But there was no real rest. A tense, fearful doze overcame us in the corner of the cabin. When we awoke, a pale dawn light trickled through the window. The air smelled acrid, like burning plastic and rotting meat. Sadie insisted we do something about Mitch. If he was truly possessed, maybe we could track him to where he'd done those horrifying rituals. The place in the Polaroids. We might destroy the shrine or something. We had no rational plan, but it seemed better than waiting around. We left the cabin with what little gear we had. My rifle, the axe, a small pack of water, rope, and first aid. We buried Rusty out back, tears silently cutting down my cheeks. I carved a small marker for him, even though part of me believed his spirit was long gone. Then we headed into the deeper woods, following a vague sense of direction from the photos. It took hours. We found ourselves going in circles. The tall pines looked identical, and our GPS was worthless, just blinking random coordinates. The sun overhead kept shifting. Once, it jumped from low in the sky to directly overhead in what felt like seconds. Another time we saw the moon peeking out, only for it to vanish behind a searing midday glare. It was maddening. At last, we stumbled onto a clearing by a fallen log. In the center stood a twisted structure made of bones and branches, splattered with dried blood. A horrifying totem to some dark force. Animal skulls, maybe deer or elk, lashed together in a spire shape. Moldering bits of flesh still clung to some of them. The stench was revolting. Sadie gagged, pressing a hand to her mouth. I approached, rifle trembling in my grip. For a moment, I was sure something was breathing inside it, as if the entire shrine lived. Then footsteps rustled the leaves behind us. Mitch emerged from behind a tree. At least, it looked like Mitch. His eyes were sunk deep into bruised sockets, and he moved with a jerkiness that defied normal human movement. There was a fresh gouge across his cheek. He whispered, "You found it. Good. Now we can feed." Before I could respond, he let out a hiss. actually hissed like an animal, then lunged at Sadie faster than seemed possible. She brought her axe up, but he batted it aside with a shriek. I tried to raise my rifle, but Mitch slammed me aside with a backhand that felt like getting kicked by a horse. I hit the ground, gasping for breath. Sadie fought like a cornered animal, but Mitch's strength was superhuman. He wrenched the axe from her grasp, then drove the handle into her gut. She collapsed, wheezing. Mitch pinned her to the ground. I could see the twisted glee in his eyes, the same grin he'd worn while raving in the cabin. "I'll feed you to Ragjaw," he said, voice throaty, almost inhuman. "He is hunger. We are all hunger." Then, shockingly, he bit Sadie's shoulder, teeth sinking deep. She screamed in agony, blood soaking her shirt. That sound snapped me out of my daze. My rifle lay a few feet away. I crawled, ignoring the pain in my ribs, grabbed it, took aim. Mitch was half-turned, giving me a shot. My hands trembled so violently I nearly dropped the gun. Then I fired. The bullet took Mitch in the side, ripping a chunk of flesh from his ribs. He flew backward off Sadie, letting out an unearthly shriek. The smell of gunpowder and something pungent, like burning metal, filled the air. Mitch hit the ground, twitching. A thick, dark fluid poured from his wounds. Not exactly red, more black than anything. I hurried over to Sadie, who was in shock, her eyes rolling, blood spurting. I pressed my hand to the wound, trying to stanch it. She winced, tears streaming. "We gotta get out," she gasped. "Please." I glanced at Mitch. His body was still, eyes glazed. But I knew better than to assume he was truly dead. The monstrous strength, the unnatural movement. He might rise again. Frantically, I looked at the bone shrine. "We have to destroy that," I whispered, not sure if it would help. I grabbed Sadie's axe from the ground, ignoring the blood. She half sat up, supporting herself on one arm. I limped to the shrine and began hacking at it. Bones snapped, sinew tore, the entire grotesque structure swaying. It took a few swings, but soon the top half crumbled. A wave of rancid odor wafted out, and I stumbled back, gagging. The moment it collapsed, the forest seemed to shift. The air rippled, like heat haze, and in the space behind it a massive shadow emerged. Something tall, antlered, its eyes burning a faint red, watching us from maybe 20 feet away. It didn't rush forward. It just stood there as if studying us, the tips of its horns scraping low branches. "Ragjaw," I heard Mitch croak behind me. A jolt of terror seized my heart. This was the creature that haunted the forest. It was real, and now I'd basically rung a dinner bell. I grabbed the rifle, gulping air. Mitch was crawling now, trailing black blood, eyes blazing with devotion toward the monstrous figure. Sadie tried to stand, but collapsed with a groan. We had no chance of outrunning Ragjaw in her state. Desperate, I called out, "Sadie, can you stand?" She grit her teeth, nodded. "Yeah!" She pushed herself up, swaying, face pale. We needed a distraction, or a plan. That's when I remembered the kerosene I'd stashed in my cabin for starting campfires more easily. If we could lead this thing back, set a trap, maybe we'd have a chance. But how to get there? Ragjaw tilted its head, stepping forward. It moved with an otherworldly grace, barely disturbing the leaves. Beneath its deer-skull face, I saw a swirl of rotted flesh. In the gloom, it was impossible to discern if it wore a skull as a mask or if that was truly its face, and the stench rolling off it was beyond words. With no time to think, I raised the rifle and squeezed off 2 shots. They tore into the creature's torso, but the effect was minimal. It staggered once, as if more surprised than hurt. Then it opened a mouth that seemed to unhinge at the jaw, letting out a hollow moan that rattled my bones. Mitch cackled from the ground, delirious. "You can't kill hunger," he wheezed. but the shots distracted Ragjaw enough for Sadie and me to limp away, leaning on each other. We skirted the clearing, heading for the direction of the cabin. The pain in my ribs flared with every step. Sadie bled from her shoulder, leaving a trail. We couldn't move fast, but we kept going. Behind us, branches snapped, the forest quivering under Ragjaw's approach. We were running out of time. When we finally reached the cabin, the sky was an angry pinkish hue that suggested dawn, though I couldn't be sure. Time was meaningless here. I told Sadie to get inside, rummage for the kerosene, while I scanned the tree line with the rifle. My hands shook so badly, it was hard to keep aim. She came out lugging a plastic container and some rags. "We can do a perimeter," she suggested, out of breath. I nodded, and we hastily splashed kerosene around the clearing in an arc that partially encircled the cabin. We had a couple of flares, enough to spark a massive blaze if we timed it right. Then we waited. My heart hammered so loudly I feared it might give me away. Sadie clutched the axe in one hand, a flare in the other. I gripped the rifle, crouched behind some stacked logs. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. The sky flickered from pink to darkness to midday light. It was disorienting. Finally, we heard the soft crunch of leaves. Ragjaw emerged between the pines, stepping into the clearing with fluid, unnatural steps. It paused, sniffing the air with that skeletal muzzle. Then, in the shadows behind it, Mitch appeared, stumbling but upright. A puppet on invisible strings. My hands went numb. I mustered the courage to stand, aimed the rifle, and fired. The bullet clipped Ragjaw's shoulder, but again, it was like pissing into a storm. The creature let out that deep moan, head swiveling to lock eyes with me. Blood or slime dripped from its gaping jaws. Sadie was to my left. I saw her raise the flare. She flicked the cap, igniting a brilliant red flame. Mitch locked eyes on her, snarling. He charged with inhuman speed. She tossed the flare onto the kerosene-soaked ground, igniting it in a sudden whoosh of flame. For a moment, the entire clearing lit up as if by the sun itself. Mitch was caught at the edge of the fire line, flames dancing along his clothes. He screamed, flailing. Ragjaw roared, rearing back, seemingly unnerved by the blaze. Seizing the chance, Sadie sprinted further around the circle, favoring her wounded shoulder. I tried to follow, but my ribs gave out, pain lancing up my side. I fell to one knee. Ragjaw pivoted toward me, stepping between the flickering tongues of fire. The heat distorted its shape, making it look even more monstrous. I fumbled for another flare. My vision swam. Ragjaw advanced slowly, like it knew I had nowhere to run. Up close, I could see the rotted lumps of flesh under its bones, the holes in its torso. A smell like decaying roadkill battered my senses. Then a scream. Sadie's voice. I couldn't see her, but I heard her hacking with the axe, possibly fending off Mitch. The forest was chaos, flames licking tree trunks, thick smoke burning my eyes. Ragjaw let out a hiss, as if annoyed. I tried to stand, but my leg buckled. Ragjaw loomed over me, raising a clawed hand. I felt a flash of pure terror that hollowed my guts. I was done, but somehow I managed to flick the flare. Red sparks spat out, scorching my hand, and I jammed it into Ragjaw's exposed ribcage. An ear-splitting shriek tore through the air as the creature recoiled, flames licking its innards. It thrashed, stumbling back, giving me just enough time to crawl away. Somehow, Sadie reached me, dragging me upright. She had a vicious cut across her forehead, blood streaking her face. "Come on!" she shouted. Through the swirling smoke, we limped away from the circle of flames, aiming for the path that led to the main road. Behind us, Ragjaw shrieked, half engulfed in fire. Mitch was on the ground, struggling, also ablaze. The acrid stench of burning hair and flesh was nauseating. We didn't look back. The flight through the forest was a blur of pain and delirium. Smoke had coated my lungs, every breath a struggle. Sadie limped, leaning heavily on me. We stumbled over roots, almost blacking out multiple times. The forest seemed to twist around us, branches reaching out like claws. Sometimes the ground was covered in fresh green moss, other times a thick blanket of dead leaves. The sky overhead flickered between night and day. I lost track of how many times I fell, or how many hours or days passed. But at some point, light cut through the branches, real daylight, and we found ourselves near the gravel parking area where my battered old pickup was parked. The sense of relief was indescribable, but my relief was tempered by heartbreak over Rusty, fear about whether Ragjaw could follow. We piled in, no seat belts, not caring if the engine might fail. I jammed the key in the ignition, turned it, and by some divine grace, it roared to life. Sadie and I exchanged a glance. It was done, or so I hoped. We sped down the dirt road, away from that cursed forest. I don't recall the exact path we took or how we made it out. Everything was hazy, memories swirling. I remember eventually hitting a paved road, then bright headlights behind us. I recall paramedics leaning over me, an IV in my arm. Sadie crying out for them to help her shoulder. We ended up in a hospital in Cumberland. My ribs were cracked, and I'd suffered minor burns. Sadie's shoulder was badly infected, and she needed weeks of recovery and rehab. The authorities listened to our story with raised eyebrows, shooting each other dubious glances. They asked if we were on drugs. They asked if the cult we described was real. They got a search party out to Savage River, but they reported finding only scorched trees, no sign of any monstrous creature or bone shrine, no body, no Mitch. A local sheriff's deputy told me with a pensive look that folks had been claiming weird sightings in that forest for decades, but there was never enough evidence for them to do more than the usual search. He asked if we'd gone in prepared, if we'd seen a bear, if maybe we'd had a near-death experience and hallucinated. I had no answers that made sense to them. Sadie drifted away after that. She was airlifted to a bigger hospital in D.C. for advanced surgery on her shoulder. I never heard from her again. Maybe she took the next plane out of Maryland. Maybe she changed her name and tried to forget. I, on the other hand, stayed for 3 weeks of recovery. Each night in that hospital bed, I'd lie awake watching the overhead lights, wondering if they'd flicker from noon to midnight in the blink of an eye, wondering if I'd hear that moan from the vents. I still do sometimes. When I was finally discharged, I had nowhere else to go. My cabin was presumably still standing, though I'd be damned if I was going back for it. I sold the land to a faceless real estate buyer who didn't ask questions. Maybe they want to build hunting lodges or a retreat center. I can't bring myself to care. Let them find out the hard way. I found a small apartment in Frederick, a place with plenty of lights and neighbors. Yet, not a day goes by that I don't replay those horrifying hours in Savage River. I see Rusty turning on me, possessed by something bigger than us both. I see Mitch cackling with black blood coursing from his neck, crawling toward me with a grin. And I see that tall, antlered shape, red eyes flickering in the smoky gloom. I don't know if we truly hurt Ragjaw, or if it just allowed us to leave. Maybe it's still out there lurking in the pines, bending time, luring the curious and the lost. Maybe it's just waiting for me to return, or for some other soul foolish enough to venture off-grid. I do know one thing. I keep the lights on now, even in broad daylight. People ask why, and I say I'm just a bit jumpy. But the truth is simpler. I know that the darkness in those woods was more than just the absence of light. It was a living, hungry thing that crawled inside your mind. warping reality. I sleep with the lights on, not because I'm scared of the dark. I do it because I know what watches from the dark. And every night in the corner of my vision, I swear I see a pair of red eyes just waiting for me to slip back into their domain. My name is Jeremy Cross. I'm 34 years old, and this happened in late October of 2022. I've thought about how to explain what really went on, and no matter how I phrase it, I sound insane. Still, I have to lay it out as honestly as possible. I'm not a veteran, I'm not a survivalist, and I've certainly never been the type to go looking for paranormal events or local legends. I was simply a burned-out freelance web designer who wanted a quiet, peaceful hike in Catoctin Mountain Park in Maryland. All I wanted was to forget my troubles for a week. Instead, I walked into a nightmare that nearly claimed my life. And maybe something more. I can't decide if it was just in my head or if something truly supernatural followed me back. I've always liked the autumn months, the crisp air, the colors of leaves, the low golden sunlight that cuts through the forest. Even the wind whispering through branches in the early twilight has its charm. I needed peace. I'd ended a bad relationship in the summer, found myself living in a cramped apartment in Frederick, and realized I was suffocating from the stress of big city life. My plan was to spend one entire week backpacking with my loyal German Shepherd, Tank, away from email notifications and deadlines, away from everything. I arrived on a Sunday afternoon, parked at a small lot near a lesser-known trailhead, and prepped my gear. I had a map, though it was a few years old, plus a compass. My phone was fully charged, and I had a solar charger in case I needed it. It wasn't the official season for crowds, so there were no families or big groups around, just the occasional serious hiker. My plan was to do a loop that would take me deep into the park and circle back around. I wrote my general route on a note I left on the dashboard of my car. That was my only real nod to safety protocol. Tank jumped out of the car, tail wagging. 5 years old, big for a shepherd, with a black and tan coat. I'd adopted him when he was a squirmy pup, the runt of a backyard litter. The first day I saw him, he tried to chew on my shoelaces and I fell in love. He was protective, too. He'd stand in front of me and bark at bigger dogs if he sensed any threat. He never backed down. We started walking, day one. The air was brisk, maybe 50 degrees, but the sun was shining. The gold, orange, and red leaves in the forest looked like a mosaic. The smell of decaying foliage brought me a sense of calm. I was so sure this trip would heal me, if only I had known what was waiting. I met only one other person on that first day, a wiry man with a coarse beard and suspiciously clean hiking gear. He was coming from the opposite direction, picking his way down a rocky path. We made eye contact and he grinned, which was friendly enough, so I asked how the trails were looking ahead. He said he'd camped near an old ranger cabin, though he didn't give many specifics, just that the place was a bit run down but had a fireplace that might still work. His name was Dale Foster, or so he told me. Something about him seemed intense. He held my gaze a fraction too long, as if examining me. I can't say why it bothered me, but it did. Dale asked where I was headed, and I mentioned the approximate route. He just nodded and told me if I kept going east, I'd see the ranger cabin eventually. I thanked him, and we went our separate ways. As he walked off, Tank whined softly under his breath, and he never whines at strangers. It made me uneasy, but I tried not to read too much into it. Dogs pick up weird vibes sometimes. By evening, I found a flat spot near a small stream and set up my tent. The night was calm. I listened to the wind in the leaves and the distant trickling of water. Tank lay curled at my side, content as ever, and I drifted to sleep with the sense that all was well. It wasn't until the second day that things began to unravel. I noticed the first anomaly after lunch on Monday. I'd planned to check my bearings using the map, but my phone's GPS started glitching. The icon showing my position drifted in circles, as if I were flying around the map. Confused, I tried restarting my phone, but the battery, which had been near full that morning, had dropped to 0. I shrugged it off. I'd brought a solar charger for a reason, and the weather was bright enough. The day progressed normally until I realized the footpaths weren't matching up to what my map indicated. According to the map, I should have crossed a small clearing by mid-afternoon, but instead I found myself climbing a ridge that didn't appear anywhere on the printed page. My compass started spinning erratically, which felt almost too cliché, but I reminded myself that digital compasses can glitch. Yet this was an analog compass. Maybe I was just using it wrong. I wasn't an expert. Still, it was disconcerting. I tried to follow the topography visually, hoping that the ridge I was on would connect to a known vantage point. As twilight neared, Tank and I emerged into a rocky overlook that gave me a glimpse of what looked like miles of uninterrupted forest. I recognized nothing. At that point, I decided to make camp before full dark and reorient in the morning. I found a sheltered nook under a large birch tree. Tank did a quick circle of the perimeter. Nothing seemed amiss except for his mood. He was whining again, hackles slightly raised. I placed a comforting hand on his back, telling him it was okay. He eventually lay down, but he kept his ears perked, as if listening for something I couldn't hear. That night, the fire refused to start for a solid 30 minutes. I went through nearly an entire box of matches, which kept fizzling out. Finally, I coaxed a small flame on some newspaper scraps. The flame burned with a weird bluish hue, flickering oddly in the windless night. When it did catch, it burned too bright, almost like a blowtorch, even though there wasn't that much kindling. The light cast twisting shadows on the surrounding trees, making them look like they had arms reaching toward me. I must have dozed eventually, wrapped in my sleeping bag with the fire still crackling. Tank was at my side, but I woke in total darkness, cold, the fire just embers. I reached for my phone to check the time. Dead, of course. By the starry sky, I guessed it was maybe 3 or 4 in the morning. My throat was dry, so I unzipped my sleeping bag and immediately froze. The bag was already unzipped. From the inside, it was wide open, like I'd crawled out of it while I was asleep. I glanced at Tank, but he wasn't there. Scrambling up, I called his name. No answer. A dread I couldn't explain shot through me. My voice echoed in the forest, bouncing off unseen ridges. I crouched low, feeding the embers with some leftover kindling, coaxing the fire back to life. The flickering light revealed Tank's leash and collar lying on the ground. Empty. Tank was an obedient dog. He might wander off to chase a squirrel, but he'd always come back, or at least bark to let me know where he was. Panic set in fast. I grabbed my flashlight, which flickered but held, and I began searching the surrounding area, calling his name until my throat felt raw. No footprints, no paw prints, just a circle of damp leaves. As I moved farther from camp, the flashlight started to dim. I decided to return to the fire before I got lost in the blackness. I was shivering with a cold that didn't entirely feel like the crisp autumn air. It felt deeper, an internal chill. I slept fitfully until dawn, expecting to hear Tank's scuffling steps at any moment, but the woods stayed silent. When the sun came up, I set out again, scanning the ground for tracks, wanting to rely on logic and reason. The dog is nearby. He'll be back. Dogs wander, but my hands were shaking from anxiety. The only footprints I found were mine. From the night before, there was no sign of his paw prints at all. It was as though he'd vanished into thin air. Numbly, I packed up my stuff and tried to hike in a consistent direction, hoping to find a ranger or a known trail. My compass needle spun lazily, refusing to fix. Occasionally, I'd climb a small rise and see a cluster of pine trees far ahead and aim for them, only to find that the forest path curved in impossible ways, bringing me back around to familiar landmarks I'd passed earlier. Time also started acting strange. In the morning, my watch read 7:02 a.m. I trudged along what felt like an hour or two, checking sporadically. My watch still said 7:02. The second hand was ticking backwards. I tapped it, banged it on my knee, held it to my ear, nothing. Then suddenly it jumped to 3:17 p.m. The sky still looked like late morning. Bewildered, I told myself the watch must have broken. It was an old analog watch, easy to get damaged in the woods, right? The day wore on, and the sun rose high and then sank again, but the watch read random times. I'd walk for what felt like an hour, only to glance down and see it had advanced by 7 hours, or regressed by 10. A creeping sense of dislocation hovered over me. I was short on water now, and my phone refused to power up, even when I tried hooking it to the solar charger. Nothing made sense. Late that afternoon, by my best guess, I stumbled into a clearing, and there was Tank, sitting calmly in the grass. Relief flooded through me. I ran to him, calling his name. He lifted his head and stared. He didn't bark, didn't wag his tail, just looked at me. For a second, his eyes seemed off color, like the pupils were too large or the irises were red-tinged. But as I drew closer, he blinked, and they looked normal again. Maybe it was just my imagination. I crouched beside him, checked him for injuries. He didn't flinch. He wasn't trembling, yet his body felt unusually cold to the touch, as if he'd been standing in ice water. He let me put his collar back on, but he wouldn't meet my gaze. I pressed my forehead to his, whispering, "Where did you go, buddy?" But he just stared at the ground. I decided we needed to find real shelter soon. Maybe that old ranger cabin Dale had mentioned. I hadn't exactly believed him before, but now it seemed like my best bet. We walked together, but Tank's usual energy was gone. He kept pace mechanically, head down, never stopping to sniff or mark territory like normal. It unsettled me, but at least he was with me. We came upon a faint trail that evening, 2 parallel ruts in the ground, half overgrown by shrubs, and followed it, hoping it led somewhere. The forest thickened around us. After a while, I spotted a structure through the trees. It had a peaked roof and what appeared to be a stone chimney. Relief flickered in my chest. A cabin. Shelter. Possibly help. As we got closer, I noticed the place was half collapsed. One side of the roof sagged inward, the windows were shattered, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. There were rusted tools scattered outside and an old sign that might have read Ranger Station Number 12, but was too worn to be sure. Night was falling fast. With no better option, I guided Tank inside. The front room had a crumbling fireplace, a few toppled chairs, and a battered wooden table. The stench of damp rot clung to everything, but there was enough space to spread my sleeping bag. I figured I'd block the door from the inside with debris for some semblance of security. Before I settled, I decided to scrounge for anything useful. Maybe there were leftover supplies. I poked around the second small room, likely a storage closet, where I found broken lanterns, moldy rags, and an empty metal tool chest. I also found footprints in the thick dust on the floor. They looked fresh, maybe even from that day. The prints were oddly shaped, though, with the front half normal, but the heel dragging in a scrape, as if whoever made them was shuffling on broken ankles. I tried not to panic. The park had some vagrants, right? Or maybe these prints belonged to Dale, who might have come through. In any case, I needed to stay calm. I returned to the main room, barricaded the door with a broken table leg, and started a small fire in the fireplace, using scraps of wood from around the cabin. sparks spat out onto the floor. Tank lay in the corner, his eyes reflecting the firelight. He looked more like a statue than a living creature. I heard the night wind pick up outside. The walls rattled. As the firelight danced on the cabin's walls, it cast shifting shadows that looked like they were moving with purpose, almost like they were creeping toward me. To distract myself, I checked the time on my watch. It said 11:59. The second hand twitched, then stopped. Once more, I tried turning on my phone. Nothing. That's when I heard a voice outside. A soft, raspy voice, humming a tune I didn't recognize. My blood ran cold. I eased myself up and peered through the broken window slats. The moon was out, shining bright enough for me to see a figure standing in the clearing, maybe 30 feet away. The same shape, the same posture, Dale. I recognized his wiry build and beard, though his face was obscured by shadow. He wasn't looking at the cabin. He seemed to be staring into the trees, humming that eerie melody. The tune repeated and repeated, driving me mad. Tank gave a low growl from deep in his throat, but he didn't move an inch. Should I call out to Dale for help? The last time we'd met, he'd seemed normal enough, if odd, but something about him now seemed different. He stood with an awkward tilt, his right leg bent at an unnatural angle. If it was truly broken, why wasn't he writhing in pain? He just kept humming. I felt pinned in place by the impossibility of it all. At some point, he turned and looked straight at me through the window, though the darkness kept me from seeing his eyes. I ducked away. Heart hammering, I waited for him to knock or call my name. Nothing. After a few moments, the humming faded into the night. When I finally dared to look back outside, he was gone. I noticed Tank was still whining softly, gaze locked on the door. I collapsed onto the floor, hardly aware that my entire body was shaking. The stress, fear, and confusion threatened to unravel me. The only comfort I had was the crackling fire. I tried to feed it, but the flames flickered greenish-blue for an instant, spitting sparks dangerously before settling into a dull orange glow. I was exhausted. Fear can only keep you conscious so long. Eventually, I drifted into a nightmare-laced sleep. I woke to the sound of scraping. My eyelids snapped open and I looked around. The fireplace was dead, only cold ashes remained. The first gray hints of dawn filtered through the broken windows, so I guessed it was early morning. The scraping noise continued, metal on wood. Slowly, I got up and moved toward the door, where I'd stacked some debris. I pressed my ear to the crack. Another scrape, then a clank, as if something metallic was being dragged. I inched back. I could see Tank was awake, but he just stared at me, not moving. My heart pounded. I wondered if I should force a confrontation or try to escape out a back window. Then, just as I was about to push the makeshift barricade aside, the noise stopped. Utter silence. A few leaves tumbled across the threshold outside, the wind sighing. I took a deep breath and slowly removed the debris, opening the door just enough to look out. The clearing was empty. In the dirt, though, I saw fresh drag marks and footprints. Wide tracks, as if something was wearing boots but scraping a metal rod behind it. They led away from the cabin into the forest. I debated following them, but I still hadn't found my bearings or a stable sense of direction. And I couldn't risk leaving the cabin if there was any chance someone or something wanted me dead. I glanced at Tank for guidance. He stood stiff, tail low, ears forward, eyes locked on me. I rummaged through my backpack, feeling relieved that all my gear was still there, until I unzipped the main compartment. My spare food, which had been vacuum-packed freeze-dried meals, was now a rancid black sludge. The smell was vile, like rotting meat. Swallowing back bile, I threw the entire package outside. The odor clung to my sinuses. I had some snack bars in my side pocket, but they looked waterlogged and decomposed. It made no sense. My supplies had been fine yesterday, albeit running low. Now they were worthless. Desperate, I checked my water bottle. The water was brownish, full of floating specks. I'd filtered it from a stream the day before, but now it looked like sewage. I gagged. The only explanation I could muster was that something in the cabin was contaminating everything. That left me with nothing but thirst and a few random crumbs. I told myself I'd find a water source soon. I'd boil it. No matter how dire it got, I would survive. I had to. Deciding I couldn't stay in this cursed place, I gathered what was left of my gear. Sleeping bag, flashlight, knife, rope, anything salvageable. I called Tank, and we slipped out into the morning light. Or what passed for it. The air felt stale. I checked my watch out of habit, but it was jammed at 4:17. No AM or PM. Just 4:17. Navigating by the sun, I walked in what I believed was a westerly direction. If I was in the eastern part of Catoctin, heading west should bring me closer to the main roads, or at least a recognized trail. Tank followed quietly, never leaving my side but refusing to make eye contact. As the hours wore on, the forest grew more tangled. I came across the same fallen log I'd passed earlier, recognized it by the shape of the fungus on its bark. A circle. That's when despair really took hold. I was stumbling through a narrow ravine when I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it might be an echo. Then they became louder, more distinct. My throat went dry. I kept going, praying it was a random hiker or maybe a ranger. Stepping out of the ravine onto flatter ground, I found myself face to face with Dale. He was standing about 15 feet away, leaning on a thick wooden staff. His right leg was bent inward at an impossible angle, the bone bulging under the skin. Yet he balanced perfectly. The look on his face was vacant, almost polite, like a stranger waiting for you to greet them. My pulse pounded. "Jeremy," he said softly, pronouncing every syllable too distinctly. "You're still out here." I swallowed, half expecting Tank to growl or bark. Instead, Tank stared, ears flattened. "Dale," I managed. "What happened to your leg? Do you need help?" He peered down at his twisted limb. "This?" He laughed without emotion. "Doesn't hurt." My mind screamed that I should run. But I couldn't see a safe path, and something about him felt powerful, even with a broken leg. I licked my dry lips. "How did you get here?" He only smiled. "I've always been here." His smile stretched too wide, the corners of his mouth trembling as if forced. Slowly, he began hobbling forward. "You and I should head to that cabin. I know the way." "We just came from there," I said, voice tight. "It's not safe." He cocked his head, stepping closer until only 6 or 7 feet separated us. The staff he leaned on wasn't wood, it was rusted iron, like a crowbar hammered straight. Where had he gotten that? Tank let out a single bark, sounding more like a warning than anything else, but still didn't attack. "We can share," Dale said. "We can all share." His eyes flickered toward Tank, then back to me. "I'd like to see if your dog can do that trick again." "What trick?" I whispered, inching backward. Dale giggled, an unhinged, childlike sound that set my nerves on edge. He tapped his crowbar on a nearby rock. Shepherds have strong jaws, very strong. He tested mine. It was the best feeling. I realized in horror that he was talking about Tank biting him. The skin above Dale's pant leg looked mangled, yet no blood seeped out. It looked more like the wounds had fused into a black, crusty scar. My stomach churned. That was my breaking point. I turned and ran. I heard the dull thump of Dale's footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look back. Tank sprinted alongside, finally showing some semblance of his old speed. We tore through the underbrush, leaping over fallen logs, ignoring the painful scratches from branches. My lungs burned. My mind felt locked on one single thought: get away. After maybe 10 minutes of all-out running, we paused to catch our breath. There was no sign of Dale. The forest was silent except for my ragged breathing. I bent over, hands on my knees, feeling close to collapse. Tank panted, but at least we'd lost him. My relief was short-lived. When I straightened, I realized I was standing on the edge of the same clearing near the collapsed cabin. Somehow, running blindly had brought us back in a circle again. I nearly wept from frustration. The door to the cabin was still half blocked by the debris I'd left. Smoke trickled from inside as if a small fire burned. That made no sense. I'd left the fireplace cold. All my rational explanations evaporated, replaced by the dread that the forest itself was playing tricks on me. I decided to search for water around the cabin, maybe find a well or a creek. Behind the cabin, the land sloped downward, forming a soggy ravine with a trickle of brownish water. I gathered up some half-broken metal pots from the cabin's dusty closet and tried to boil the water over a small fire pit outside. The flames kept dying. Smoke hung thick in the air, heavy and rank. Tank watched me the entire time, his gaze unsettlingly calm. I don't remember how long I wrestled with the fire, but eventually I managed to heat some water to a low simmer. Ash flakes kept falling into the pot, turning the water into a muddy sludge. Out of desperation, I let it cool and forced myself to drink. My lips and tongue felt numb afterward, but I was too thirsty to care. That was when I heard a crash inside the cabin, followed by Tank's sudden bark. Finally, a real dog bark, loud and aggressive. Grabbing my flashlight and the crowbar I'd found next to the fireplace, I edged toward the cabin entrance. I pushed the door open, heart pounding. Furniture was overturned, and by the faint light that filtered in through the windows, I saw Tank standing near the far wall, hair raised, barking at Tank. I stopped breathing. There were 2 dogs, both identical. The second one stood by the fireplace, its head cocked, looking at me with a disturbing parody of my dog's expression. The second dog's muzzle was slightly twisted, like the skin had been stretched. It blinked once, very slowly, then parted its jaws to reveal black gums. Without warning, it lunged at the real Tank. Chaos erupted. The real Tank barked and latched onto the intruder's shoulder, but the imposter dog didn't make any normal canine sounds. It screeched like a broken siren. Blood, the color of tar, splattered on the floor. The imposter whipped its head around and bit at Tank's ear. I was frozen with terror for maybe half a second before I charged forward with the crowbar, swinging down on the imposter's spine. The blow connected with a wet crunch. The creature hissed, turning to face me, eyes glowing red in the gloom. I felt a wild surge of panic and disgust. Everything about it looked like Tank, yet it was all wrong. I swung again, blindly, tears in my eyes, praying I wouldn't accidentally hit my real dog. This time, the crowbar met the creature's skull with a sickening crack. It collapsed to the floor, twitching. Tar-like fluid oozed out, forming a stinking pool. I stumbled back, gulping for air. Tank let out a final snarl and then stepped away, blood dripping from his muzzle. The imposter's body began to shrivel, the fur peeling away to reveal pale, mottled flesh. It convulsed violently for a few seconds, then lay still. I wanted to vomit, but there was no time to process what I'd just witnessed. A sudden movement near the doorway made me spin. Dale stood there, face drawn in a huge grin, the corners of his mouth trembling. "You're learning," he said. "But are you sure you picked the right one?" He gestured to the dead thing on the floor. "Or maybe that was your real dog." Rage and terror collided inside me. Without thinking, I raised the crowbar, fully ready to kill him too, but Dale seemed to anticipate the move. He stepped back into the yard. For a moment, I glimpsed the silhouette of his broken leg. He was now limping badly, but still not collapsing. "See you soon," he said softly, before turning and disappearing behind the cabin. I dropped the crowbar, my hands shaking so badly that I couldn't hold it. Tank whined next to me, pressing his head against my leg. I looked at him. My real dog. I saw genuine canine eyes there, full of fear and vulnerability, just as freaked out as I was. That helped quell the sudden doubt that maybe I'd killed my real companion. "It's okay," I whispered, tears burning my eyes. "It's okay, buddy." I had no idea if it truly was, but saying it helped. The body on the floor continued to wither, bones collapsing in on themselves, the skull splitting open. I tried not to look at it too closely. The stench was unbearable. I needed to get out of this cursed place before more horrors showed up. But the forest paths had led me back time and again. In a wave of desperate thinking, I considered heading in any single direction, day and night, never stopping, living off found water and the occasional squirrel if I had to. Or I could break into a full sprint, maybe break the cycle. But exhaustion threatened to overwhelm me every time I tried to push too hard. It was like the forest itself dampened my strength, forcing me to turn back. It was near dusk again, a swirling, miserable dusk, when I saw headlights flicker through the trees. The glow bobbed up and down, maybe a quarter-mile away. I heard the faint rumble of an engine. My heart soared. A road, maybe a ranger's truck. Tank barked once and took off in that direction. I sprinted after him. Bursting through a patch of undergrowth, I found a narrow gravel road. Indeed, a truck was parked there, engine idling, headlights on. It looked official. Park Ranger green, with the emblem on the side. A figure in uniform stepped out, shining a flashlight at me. I shielded my eyes, nearly falling to my knees in relief. He approached with caution. "Sir, are you all right?" He sounded normal, concerned. I coughed, tears mixing with sweat. I've been lost. Something's out here. My dog." Words failed me. Tank pressed himself against my leg. The ranger told me his name was Martin, or at least that's what his badge said. He looked older, maybe late 50s, with a graying mustache. He helped me into his truck, offered me water from a big thermos. It tasted real. That alone almost made me collapse in gratitude. "It's all right," Martin said, revving the engine. "We'll get you to a station, figure out where you came from." I sank into the seat, Tank curled at my feet. My entire body throbbed with bruises, cuts, and the deeper pain of exhaustion. I told Martin that a man named Dale was stalking me, that there was something inside the forest that made electronics glitch, that I saw impossible things. He nodded, face set in a concerned frown, glancing at me in the rearview mirror now and then. "Sometimes people get turned around," he said gently. "Catoctin can be tricky. Let's get you some rest." We drove for a long time. I'm not sure how I stayed awake. Fear still clawed at the edges of my mind, but I was beyond numb. The headlights illuminated a winding gravel road, and eventually we pulled into a small clearing with a wooden sign that read, "Park Service Access Only." A low building squatted in the center, lights glowing in a single window. Martin helped me out and led me inside. There was a desk, some radio equipment, and a couple of chairs. It felt dreamlike, but also stable. No impossible distortions. "Sit," he said, pointing to a chair. "Let me see if I can get you some first aid, maybe some fresh clothes. You look like you've been wrestling barbed wire." I nodded. My skin was scratched raw, my clothes torn and filthy. Tank lay at my feet, still watchful. Martin disappeared into another room. That's when the radio on the desk crackled to life. "Station 4, do you copy?" a voice said. "This is Station 4, come back." The voice sounded eerily like Martin's. Distorted, yes, but identical in pitch and timbre. The hair rose on the back of my neck. Slowly, I picked up the radio receiver. "Hello?" I said in a shaky voice. "We copy." There was static then. "Is that you, Martin?" the voice asked. "Where the hell have you been? Over?" My grip on the radio tightened. Martin was in the other room. I stared at the open doorway, but he didn't come out. The voice continued. "We've got a missing hiker out there, name's Jeremy Cross. You find him yet?" My blood ran cold. I set the receiver down, heart pounding. If Martin was out there on the radio, who was the man in the other room? Everything in me screamed to leave, but I was so weak. I swallowed the rising panic and clutched Tank's collar. I took one step toward the door, just as Martin re-entered, carrying a first aid kit and a folded blanket. He set them down on the desk and took off his hat. "All right," he said. "Let's take care of those cuts." He looked at my wide-eyed expression. "What's wrong?" I pointed at the radio, which was now silent. His gaze flicked to it, then back to me. He exhaled softly, as if disappointed. "It's broken," he said. "I just heard," I began, but he cut me off. "It doesn't work," he repeated. "Hasn't worked in years." He offered me a small, tight smile that felt more like a threat than reassurance. "You're tired, Jeremy. Come on, let me help." He stepped closer, took hold of my wrist gently. That was when I noticed something about his eyes. They had a subtle red tint in the whites, as if they were irritated or bloodshot, but far too uniform. That same color I thought I saw in Tank's eyes earlier. My vision swam with dread. In one swift motion, I pulled my wrist free. Martin's eyes narrowed. Now, that's not polite. He sounded so calm, but there was an undercurrent to his voice, an almost gloating quality. I backed away, stumbling, and Tank started to growl low in his throat. Martin sighed. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." He reached for something behind him. My pulse raced, but I wasn't fast enough to react. He pulled out a tranquilizer gun, the kind used to subdue wild animals. The barrel was already aimed at my chest. Before he could fire, Tank lunged, teeth bared. The shot went off, whizzing past me, lodging somewhere in the wall. Martin yelped as Tank knocked him to the floor. The tranquilizer gun clattered away. Without hesitating, I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the desk and swung it down on Martin's head. Painful adrenaline shot through my battered arms. The blow connected. Martin cried out. He shoved Tank aside with terrifying strength, sending my dog crashing into the desk. Then he lurched to his feet, blood trickling from a gash on his temple, blood that looked dark and almost congealed. I swung again, but he caught the flashlight mid-swing. His grip was inhumanly strong. He twisted it out of my hand. I scrambled for the tranquilizer gun, but Martin hurled the flashlight at me, hitting my shoulder. I fell, dazed. Tank, with a furious snarl, launched at Martin's legs. The ranger hissed, an unnatural sound, then slammed a fist down on Tank's back, making him yelp. Rage boiled in me. I crawled toward the desk, searching frantically for anything to use as a weapon. My hand closed around a utility knife near a stack of papers, and I spun around, slashing wildly. Martin tried to jump back but was off balance, and the blade cut across his forearm. A thin rivulet of blackish-red fluid oozed. He stared at the wound, a flicker of shock on his face, then glared at me with fury. "You worthless," he began. But Tank recovered and clamped onto his calf. Martin howled in pain, and I used the moment to drive the knife into his side right above the hip. He gasped, eyes bulging, then staggered. I twisted the blade, half mad with fear. He dropped to his knees, and I wrenched the knife out, panting. Martin collapsed onto his side, breathing hard. Blood pooled around him, thick and black. I expected him to shrivel up like the imposter dog, but he remained mostly intact, just dying. His eyes flicked to me, the red tint growing more vivid. He coughed, or tried to, then exhaled his last breath. Tank let go, backing away, muzzle smeared with that same foul fluid. I stared, trembling, as Martin's body lay sprawled, unmoving. Is he really dead, I wondered, or is he going to get back up? After half a minute, it was clear he wasn't moving. I collapsed, my entire body shaking. Tank whimpered, licking my hand. The overhead light flickered. Outside, the wind howled. Something felt wrong about the building, the night, everything. For a fleeting second, I allowed myself to think, we survived. But the radio on the desk crackled again, making me jump. An identical voice said, Martin, come in. Found the vehicle. Over. Then static. I hesitated, unsure whether to respond, certain that another imposter might be on the other end. My mind was too battered to decide. I left the radio as it was. As I clutched Tank's collar, I heard a distant engine, a new one, or maybe the same. Not wanting any more close calls, I forced my throbbing legs to stand. Come on, buddy, I said to Tank. He obeyed, though he limped slightly. My dog was wounded, but hopefully not too badly. We had to get out of that station, back into the trees. I stuffed the utility knife in my belt, grabbed the tranquilizer gun with a few spare darts, and took off into the night. The darkness pressed around us. All sense of direction was lost. My phone was still dead, my watch was useless. I expected the forest to swallow us up again, bring us back to the cabin or some new horror. But after stumbling for maybe an hour, we saw a faint orange glow ahead. I tensed, bracing for another trick, but as we drew closer, it resolved into the dim lights of a road. A real asphalt road, with a guardrail and everything. Could it be the main scenic route that passes through? Hope swelled. With the last of my energy, I staggered up the embankment. A beat-up SUV rolled by, headlights flashing. I waved my arms, shouting. The driver slowed but then sped up and kept going, obviously seeing a ragged figure in the dark and deciding not to risk it. But just seeing a civilian car gave me a rush of relief. I realized the forest's hold might be waning, or else we'd broken out by sheer luck. Minutes later, another set of headlights appeared. A park ranger truck from the other direction. My blood ran cold. Was it going to be another Martin? I almost fled, but my legs were too weak, and Tank was barely standing. If we stayed out here, we might die from exposure or collapse. I flagged it down, trembling with fear and exhaustion. It pulled over, and a man in a ranger uniform hopped out. He approached cautiously, shining a flashlight. I wanted to run, but I was too exhausted. Tank just lay down, spent. The man's eyes looked normal, pale blue with normal whites. No red tinge. He was older, heavy-set, and had a radio crackling with some normal broadcast. "Sir," he said gently, taking in my state. "My God, what happened to you? Are you hurt?" I started babbling about Dale, about the station. He grabbed his radio and started calling something in, telling them to dispatch an ambulance. He said his name was Phillips, that he'd been on patrol. His face had genuine concern, not that eerie calm. Relief poured out of me in sobs. "We killed one of them," I heard myself saying, half delirious. "I stabbed him. He wasn't normal, he was—" I couldn't finish. Ranger Phillips's radio buzzed again, and I heard normal-sounding voices asking for a location. No red-eyed clones, no impossible illusions. Then Phillips looked at me sympathetically. "Sit tight, we'll get you medical attention," he said. "You're safe now." I slumped in the seat of the truck as we drove along the winding road. I looked out the window at the dark forest. I half expected to see Dale's shape hobbling among the trees, or that monstrous dog's eyes glowing. But nothing emerged. No illusions, no twisted horrors, just regular trees and flickers of wildlife. Tank rested his head on my lap, letting me stroke his fur. Everything felt painfully raw, but real. We reached a small ranger station, an actual functioning one, and soon paramedics arrived in an ambulance. They insisted on taking me to a hospital in Frederick. I was borderline hypothermic, severely dehydrated with more scratches and bruises than I could count. They gave me water, asked if I had any life-threatening injuries. I shook my head numbly. I'd almost prefer they not ask about what I'd seen. The paramedics also checked Tank over, gave him some basic care for minor cuts, and said we'd need a vet to look at him, but he seemed stable. My dog was alive, thank God. On the way to the hospital, everything about the night started to blur. My mind tried to piece together a rational explanation, but failed. In a swirl of exhaustion, I drifted off, half sure that I was still in a nightmare. When I awoke, sunlight was pouring into the ambulance through a small window. The paramedic told me we were almost there. My heart pounded as I realized this was real, no illusions this time. At the hospital, doctors checked my vitals. My story of being lost in the woods was enough for them, though some staff seemed to suspect I'd been assaulted or something worse. I told them about the bizarre things I'd seen, but they just chalked it up to dehydration, hypothermia, delirium. They said a ranger had indeed gone missing that night, a Martin Cook who was found dead on a remote road. The official cause of death was uncertain. They asked if I'd seen anything. I told them a version of the truth that was as close as I dared. He tried to restrain me, we fought, and I stabbed him in self-defense. I was still half out of my mind, but the local authorities seemed surprisingly lenient. A detective took notes, looked uneasy, and told me they'd investigate further, but they also told me that things happen in these vast parks. I had to wonder if I was not the first person to have a story like this. Tank stayed in an overnight kennel near the hospital for observation. They said physically he seemed okay, though he was traumatized. The next day, I was released and allowed to pick him up. We drove home in my battered old car in silence. Once safe in my apartment, I tried to recover, but for days I didn't sleep well. I'd jolt awake, convinced I heard footsteps or humming. Tank often barked at shadows. Sometimes his eyes caught the light just right and appeared red for a split second, sending me into near panic. I'd check the mirror, expecting to see something else staring back from my own reflection. My phone never turned on again. Some kind of permanent damage, presumably. My watch, which I'd found in my jacket pocket, was stopped at 4:17. The glass cracked. I often wonder if I'm the real Jeremy Cross, or if somewhere in those woods an imposter took my place while I wandered out as something else. My parents and closest friends claim I look the same, act the same, though maybe more paranoid. But the nightmares haven't faded. Sometimes, in the quiet darkness of my bedroom, I hear a dog panting, and I'm not sure if it's Tank or something else waiting to wear his face. I'll walk through the house, checking every corner, half expecting to see Dale with his broken leg and crowbar humming that tune. I've tried to find closure, but some nights I can still taste the bitterness of the water from that stream, can still smell the rotting sludge in my backpack. My mind replays the sight of that second dog shriveling up after we struck it down, the way Martin's eyes glowed with an impossible red, and the way the forest refused to let me go until it was done with me. I've told myself 100 times that I escaped, that it's over, that the illusions or spirits or whatever they were can't follow me here. And yet, every so often, I'll catch a glimpse in the corner of my vision, a shape just beyond the hallway door, or a reflection in the window that isn't quite mine. Even in broad daylight, I sometimes hear a distant whisper or a voice like Dale's, echoing, "See you soon," followed by an eerie laugh that belongs to no one I've ever met. Then Tank will whine, his ears flat, as if he hears it too, I tell myself I'm imagining it, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure of anything anymore. That's my story, for what it's worth. I don't expect anyone to believe me entirely, but if you ever go hiking deep in Catoctin Mountain Park, if you see a friendly-looking stranger with a twisted gait, or a lost dog that seems a little too perfect, be careful. Some trails can lead you straight to hell, and once you're in, you might never find your way back. If you do manage to leave, don't be surprised if the forest keeps a piece of you, or if it sends something in your place. I might be living proof, or I might be the creature that got out. I'm not sure which. All I know is that I've never gone hiking again, and I doubt I ever will. My name is Rachel Carr. I am 28 years old, and these events happened in August of 2024. I need to record it all while the details remain vivid, because I'm afraid of how my memory keeps warping. People tell me I've changed since it happened, and I think I have, but I'm not sure I'm the one in full control anymore. I live in Washington, D.C. and work in data analytics, or at least I did, before I took time off for what was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip in Catoctin Mountain Park, Maryland. My best friend Emily Monroe invited me. Em is 29, a bit older than me by a few months, and we'd grown up together in Frederick County. After high school, we drifted in and out of each other's lives, but we always found a way back to being close. This time, it was Em who reached out, saying I'd been avoiding her for a year, which was true. I'd gotten so burned out and shut myself away from everyone. She wanted us to spend a weekend outdoors with her boyfriend, Daniel Klein. Danny is 31, laid back, a go-with-the-flow type who's always talking about cosmic energies. For once, I decided to trust Em's instincts. Maybe getting off the grid for a few days was exactly what I needed. Catoctin Mountain Park sits just north of Thurmont, Maryland. It's known for its beautiful overlooks and winding, wooded trails. By early August, the forest is thick with the green leaves and bristling with cicadas. Emily suggested we hike around the lesser-known Hog Rock Overlook, because Danny supposedly discovered an unofficial trail that led to a hidden scenic area. The timing was perfect, hot and humid, but we had plenty of water, gear, and bug spray. I wanted to reconnect with nature, give my mind a break from analytics and notifications. I had no idea I'd lose much more than my phone signal out there. We met at the visitor center on a Friday afternoon. Emily was the type who triple-checked the gear. She had a large battered backpack with first aid supplies, a portable water filter, plus a brand new sleeping bag. She gave me a once-over when I arrived with my old external frame pack. "Is that the same one you had in high school?" she joked, throwing me a concerned look. "Yep," I said, forcing a laugh. "If it's not broken, right?" Danny was waiting for us in the parking lot by his weathered SUV. He wore tie-dye shorts, hiking boots, and a contented smile. "All right," he said. "I've got a map, paper copy, no trust in my phone, and I've got the coordinates for this unmarked trail on my GPS. We might do a bit of bushwhacking, but the area's apparently something special." He winked, and Em rolled her eyes at him fondly. We piled into the SUV, and Danny drove us deeper into the park, past signs for Cunningham Falls, where families were congregating. He turned off onto a narrower road that twisted uphill beneath the canopy of tall oak trees. The cell service soon vanished. That was expected. My phone lost 2 bars, then everything turned to no service. I sighed, thinking this might do me some good. Turn off the noise of the world. We parked near Hog Rock Overlook, shouldered our packs, and started on a small marked path that looped behind a thick cluster of pines. The first day passed pleasantly enough. The only weird glitch was my phone's battery dying unnaturally fast, even on airplane mode. I turned it off to conserve power. I told myself it was probably just old. I'd replaced the battery months ago, so this was frustrating but not alarming. Emily teased me. "You're out here to disconnect, right? Maybe that phone's helping you along." The sun was dropping by the time we found a clearing to set up camp. It was a normal campsite in the sense that there were no amenities except a ring of stones that might have once been used for a fire. We pitched 2 tents. Emily and Danny took one, I had the other. We built a small fire and Danny started weaving some story about magnetic anomalies in this part of the park. He claimed the forest had strong energy fields that could mess with compasses. I laughed it off until I watched him fish out his old mechanical compass. The needle kept spinning. He tapped it, frowned, gave a half laugh, and said, "See?" We chalked it up to the possibility of faulty equipment or iron deposits in the ground. By the time the moon rose, we were sitting around the fire telling jokes and catching up. Emily pressed me on why I went off the grid for so long. I gave half-truths. Work stress, that's all. The actual reasons, feeling a creeping sense of dread in my own life, a sense that I was being watched, didn't come out. I didn't even know how to articulate that. I was just happy they seemed to accept me. Maybe the forest was a place for second chances. That night, we noticed the firelight had a slight bluish cast. Danny teased us that it was just a chemical or mineral from the wood we were burning, but it still felt unnatural, like holding a black light lamp over the logs. After an hour or two, we decided to turn in. Before crawling into my sleeping bag, I took one last look at the starry sky overhead. Everything felt bigger out there, the air sharper, more alive. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the chirping insects and the distant hoots of an owl. But I woke in the middle of the night with a jolt, certain I heard a whisper of my name. Rachel. I didn't see anything in my tent, but my heart hammered. I told myself it was a dream. By morning, we discovered something bizarre. All of our sleeping bags were partially unzipped from the inside, as if we'd climbed out of them in our sleep. Except my bag was still around my body, just wide open. Emily had that happen too, and she insisted she always kept it fully zipped. Danny laughed about it, but I could see tension in his shoulders. "Sleepwalkers, I guess," he muttered. We let it go. We had new territory to explore. That day, we packed up and aimed to hike Danny's unofficial trail. He had coordinates saved in a handheld GPS unit. The device said we were about a mile from the route. We started bushwhacking, breaking through thick brush, forging a path forward. For an hour, we trudged uphill. The forest canopy was dense, making everything dimmer. When we checked the GPS, it insisted we'd gone only 1/10 of a mile. That made no sense. We had easily traveled more distance than that. Emily rummaged for her phone to cross-reference a map, but it wouldn't turn on. My phone, likewise, was lifeless. Even the battery pack Emily had was blinking empty. Tempers began to fray. "We'll do this the old-fashioned way," Danny said. He took out a folded paper map, a gift from an older hiking buddy. According to the map, Hog Rock Overlook was behind us, maybe 2 miles south. We compared it to the slope we'd just ascended, but the map's topography didn't match. Emily shook her head. We might not even be in the right section of the park. We all took a break to reorient. While rummaging in my pack, I noticed my water bottle had grown warm and tasted foul, as if it were stagnant. "Gross," I muttered, spitting it out, but I didn't want to dehydrate. Danny gave me some water from his supply, which was still cool. We decided to follow the slope downward, assuming it would eventually lead us back to a main trail, or at least a park boundary. Around mid-afternoon, as we meandered downhill, the trees opened up and revealed a stone cabin half buried in brambles. It was definitely old. The roof had caved in near the back. Vines crawled up the mossy walls. No official sign, no marker, just a black yawning doorway. I felt a jolt of fear and curiosity at once. Em turned to me, eyebrows raised. "Should we check it out?" she asked. I'm not sure why I said yes so quickly. I had a flutter in my chest that said this is a bad idea, but at the same time, something compelled me forward. The place felt familiar, like I had once dreamed of it. We carefully pushed aside the brush and stepped inside. It was dim within, and the air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves. The floor was rough stone, coated in dirt and debris. There was a rotted cot in the corner, and near the far side a broken fireplace. Most unsettling was a discolored, patchy rug in the center of the room, caked with mold, as if it had been there for decades. The hairs on my arms stood on end. The silence felt wrong. Danny tried to lighten the mood. "This is actually kind of cool," he said. "Imagine the history. Probably an old hunting cabin." Emily prodded the ragged cot with her boot. It toppled, revealing a jumble of mummified leaves. "I doubt it's safe to stay in, but maybe we could camp nearby," she said. The last thing I wanted was to linger, but a creeping fatigue came over me. The day felt longer than it should have. We ended up pitching our tents in a clearing maybe 50 feet from the cabin, staying just close enough to investigate if we needed shelter from a sudden storm. Emily insisted we keep an eye on it, in case any animals scurried out. We gathered wood for a fire. The night air was thick and quiet, so quiet that we could hear ourselves breathing. The second night was when things really started to feel wrong. The first sign was the color of the fire again, bluish, but this time sparks shot up, hung in the air, then winked out with a hiss. It was mesmerizing and disturbing. We tried to chalk it up to weird chemicals in the wood or fungus in the logs. Emily tried to make a phone video of it, but her phone was dead. We gave up, telling ourselves it was just a bizarre phenomenon. Later, we decided to get water from a small stream we'd spotted. Emily volunteered, saying she needed to clear her head. I watched her walk off with a flashlight, disappearing behind tall pines. Danny and I kept the fire going. We chatted about trivial stuff, how we might have gone in circles that day, whether we should cut the trip short in the morning. Time seemed to drag. After what felt like an hour, I looked at my watch. It read 8:20 p.m. Last I'd checked, it was 7:50 p.m. It felt both far longer and far shorter than half an hour. Danny's watch read 9:40 p.m. A wave of confusion passed between us. Whose watch was right? More time stretched, maybe another half hour. Emily still hadn't returned. My nerves spiked. I called her name, but only the whisper of the wind answered. Danny looked worried now. "She should have been back ages ago," he said, flicking on his flashlight. We decided to split up for a few minutes to look for her. I stayed near the campsite in case she returned. Danny headed into the dark. I listened to the rustle of branches, shifting shadows, the quiet throb in my chest. I tried to quell my imagination, but everything felt infected with dread. Suddenly, I saw a silhouette near the edge of the firelight. "Em," I called gently. The figure stepped forward, and it was her. The flashlight dangled from her fingers, turned off. Her face was half obscured by shadows. Something was off about her eyes, like she was focusing on a point behind me. She had a cut on her cheek, a shallow scrape with dried blood. "Em, oh my God, are you okay?" I rushed over, but she just stood there, staring past me. She was breathing in shallow rasps. "Where have you been?" I pressed. "It's been over an hour, maybe more." Emily's lips curled into a slight smile. "What do you mean?" She spoke with a flatness I'd never heard. "I wasn't gone that long. I just went to get water." My skin crawled. "Let me see that cut," I said, reaching out. She jerked away as if my touch burned her. I tried again. "You're bleeding." She blinked exactly once, slowly. "I'm fine." Her voice didn't sound quite like her own, but a forced imitation. 1,000 questions tangled in my mind. Did she fall? Get lost? Why wasn't she explaining what happened? Instead, she simply moved to the fire and stood there, gazing at the blue-tinged flames. A minute later, Danny stumbled back into the clearing, panting as if he'd run a mile. "Rachel, I can't." He froze mid-sentence when he saw Emily. Relief washed over him first, then confusion. "Emily, where did you—" He stepped forward, but she gave him that same distant smile. "I was just here," she said. "What's wrong?" We asked her where she went, how long she'd been gone, why she had a fresh scrape on her face. She had no memory of the time, no real explanation, only vague answers like, "I needed to see something," or "I forgot to get water." The jug she'd taken was empty. Something about her tone tightened the space in my lungs. It was as if she was going through the motions of normal conversation, but behind her eyes there was nothing. We tried to settle in for sleep. The darkness pressed in. I recall hearing a soft voice, half singing, half laughing from Emily's tent, but only for an instant. The firelight had turned from blue back to a more conventional orange glow, which made me question if I was imagining everything. Exhaustion overwhelmed me. Eventually, I managed to drift off. I woke in the wee hours, jolted by the feeling of my sleeping bag unzipping again. This time, I distinctly felt it sliding open around my ankles. In the faint moonlight through my tent's flap, I saw the zipper tab moving by itself, with no hand guiding it. My heart nearly jumped out of my throat. I grabbed at the zipper, but it was cold to the touch, too cold, like ice. My mind raced with confusion and fear. Was I sleepwalking again, hallucinating? I squeezed my eyes shut until the movement stopped. It eventually did, leaving me gasping in shock. By morning, I found my pack half unpacked, my clothes strewn around outside the tent. I couldn't find my phone. Danny discovered that his printed map had somehow gotten wet and disintegrated into a pulpy mess. Emily's backpack was neatly closed, but inside her food was moldy, so green and fuzzy it looked weeks old, even though we'd bought it fresh the day before. "That's impossible," Danny whispered. No one had an explanation. Emily seemed calmer in the daylight, though still subdued. She let me clean her scrape with the first aid kit. It wasn't deep, but I noticed a faint symbol etched into the dried blood. It might have been a trick of the light, but it looked almost like a thin crescent shape. I asked her if she remembered hitting her face on a branch or rock. She brushed off the question. "I'll be fine," she repeated, her voice stiff. We decided we had to head back to a known trail and leave as soon as possible. We had enough water for maybe another day if we rationed carefully. The plan was to descend the slope because logically that would lead us toward the established trails. We broke camp, but we left the cabin behind with an uneasy sense that we might be followed. I could almost feel something in the back of my head urging me to return. I didn't tell Emily or Danny that I kept hearing faint whispers in my ears, "Rachel, you came back." That day I was jumpy, spinning around whenever the wind blew, or a branch snapped. As we hiked, the ground seemed to shift underfoot. At one point, we found ourselves walking uphill again, though we'd been certain we were going downhill. The sun soared overhead, then abruptly sank lower. Our sense of time fractured. My watch said noon, Danny's said 2 in the afternoon, and Emily's watch had simply stopped. She stared at its hands, unmoving at 12:13. Her face flickered with a hint of alarm, but she quickly masked it. By what we assumed was late afternoon, we spotted a wide, overgrown path that might have been a fire road. Relief surged. We followed it, hoping it would lead us out of the park. Instead, after about a mile, the path gently curved, and we saw the stone cabin through the thinning trees. The same one, vines and moss, collapsed roof. No doubt about it. I nearly dropped my pack in shock. Danny let out a curse, loud and furious. How the hell? We were going in the opposite direction, he hissed. This is insane. Emily just stared, expressionless. Slowly, she said, "We should stay in the cabin tonight. It's safer than tents." My gut twisted in protest. The cabin felt anything but safe. But we were losing daylight, and everything felt stacked against us. Our water was dangerously low, my legs ached, and the forest felt claustrophobic. Reluctantly, we trudged inside. We cleared away debris and tried to make enough space on the stone floor for sleeping bags. The smell of mildew and rot burned my nose. While rummaging around, I found the moldy rug still in the center. Something was off about it. I kneeled to move it aside, noticing a slight hollow reverberation when I tapped the floor. I called for Danny. We rolled the rug away. Beneath the rotted fabric, hidden among dirt and twigs, was a trapdoor handle. A square piece of wood set into the cabin's foundation. Danny and I exchanged a glance. Emily stood behind us, silent. "Should we?" Danny started, swallowing hard. "No, I don't think so," I whispered, skin crawling. But Emily knelt down with surprising intensity, her eyes locked on the trapdoor. "There's something in there," she said. "Something that matters." Her voice had a tremor that almost sounded excited. She grasped the rusted handle before either of us could stop her. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing a narrow pit descending into darkness. I shone my flashlight, but the beam seemed to get swallowed after a few feet. A smell of damp earth and something stale rose from below. "Don't go down there," I said, heart pounding. "It could collapse or be full of disease." Emily gave me a sideways glance, lips twitching into a half smile. "We won't go now, but it might be shelter if a storm comes." Then she closed it as easily as she'd opened it, leaving me unsettled. We tried to make a fire in the broken fireplace. The wood refused to catch for the longest time, as if the air itself was resisting combustion. Eventually, it sparked, burning once more with that bluish flame. The night settled in around us. We rationed what was left of our food, crackers, and a bit of jerky. Emily mostly stared into space, quietly humming a tune that neither Danny nor I recognized. I think it was near midnight when the horror escalated. I woke from a light doze to the sound of Danny screaming. My heart shot into my throat. I scrambled up, disoriented in the flickering low light from the dying fire. Emily was gone from her spot on the floor. Danny's screams came from the far corner, near the fireplace. I ran over to see him pinned to the wall, thrashing. Vines, thick, ropey vines that must have invaded through cracks in the stone, wrapped around his torso and limbs. His mouth was open in a soundless wail now, eyes wide with terror. Blood trickled from the corners of his lips. I tried to pull the vines free, but they were impossibly strong. As if alive, they twitched. The second I touched them, they felt slimy and warm, not like normal plants. My mind reeled. With every yank, Danny coughed in agony. The vines were digging into his flesh. I shouted for Emily, no answer. Then I heard her voice from behind me, soft. "He shouldn't have come," she said. I turned to see Emily standing near the trapdoor, half in shadow. Her posture was rigid, face expressionless. Something in me snapped. "What are you talking about? Help me," I shouted. Danny was choking. She walked forward calmly. "He's interfering," she said. not even looking at him. She bent down next to me. Her fingers brushed the vines. I expected her to pull them off, but instead they tightened. Danny's eyes rolled back in his head as he coughed up blood. She was controlling them somehow. The scream that tore from my throat was raw. I grabbed a piece of broken cot frame, a jagged wooden board, and swung it at the vines. I managed to sever one. It spurted a dark, watery fluid that smelled of rot. Emily's face contorted in a moment of fury, and she hissed at me, an animal-like sound. She was not herself. I hacked and yanked, screaming Danny's name. Emily pinned me with a gaze that didn't belong to her. "You can't save him," she murmured. Her voice layered with something else, something older, deeper. "He's not chosen." Then, suddenly, she stiffened, as if torn by an internal battle. One side of her face twitched, pained. Her eyes flickered from dark to bright. She let out a moan that sounded like Emily's real voice, crying, "Rachel, I don't want—" Then she went silent, and the cold, distant stare returned. She turned away from me, heading toward the trapdoor. With a final desperate yank, I pulled Danny free, his body slumped to the floor. He was horribly injured. Deep welts encircling his limbs, shallow punctures in his gut. Blood was everywhere. I pressed my hands against the gashes, trying to stanch the flow, my entire body trembling. "Stay with me, Danny," I pleaded. His eyes fluttered. Rachel," he rasped, "I can't do anything for her." His words hammered into my head. I wasn't sure if he was telling me to leave Emily behind or if he was warning me about something else. He coughed violently, thick blood running down his chin, then his head lolled. I had to check for a pulse, but his eyes were already glassy. I screamed his name, pressing against his chest, feeling his heart flutter once more. Then it stopped. I can't explain how my mind processed that. One minute, we were a trio of friends lost in the woods. The next, I was cradling Danny's lifeless body. My hands shook so violently I could barely stand. But adrenaline surged. Emily, whatever she'd become, was pulling open the trapdoor again. The stench of stale earth and something vile wafted up. She disappeared down the short ladder into the dark. The cabin was eerily still. The vines around the fireplace sagged, as if they'd lost their animation once Danny was no longer resisting. I swallowed a wave of revulsion and grief. I knew I had to do something. If Emily had any chance to return to normal, I had to confront this madness at its source. I found my flashlight, which miraculously still worked. Then, with a trembling breath, I climbed down into the darkness. The ladder went 6 or 7 rungs down, leading to a cramped dirt corridor. The walls were packed earth, supported by rotted timbers. The corridor angled sharply, like a shallow ramp, deeper underground. I followed it, hearing only my own ragged breaths. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became, thick with dampness and a coppery tang that reminded me of blood. My flashlight flickered. I tapped it, panicked, and it steadied. I had no concept of time. All I knew was I had to find Emily. After maybe 20 yards, the corridor opened into a low chamber. My beam swept across lumps on the ground, bones scattered across the dirt floor. Some looked old, stained black with time. Others seemed fresher, with bits of desiccated flesh. My stomach lurched. The chamber smelled putrid, like a charnel house. But the worst was at the center, a partial skeleton laid out, bound together by twisting roots or vines, its skull turned toward me. In the glare of my flashlight, I thought I saw it blink, 2 hollow sockets flaring with a dim glow. I nearly dropped the light. Emily was there, kneeling beside the skeleton, her head bowed. She was muttering something I couldn't quite catch. Maybe a guttural chant, or old words I didn't recognize. Her hair hung limp around her face, and when she glanced up, her eyes were strangely reflective, like a cat's in the dark. My heart hammered. The corridor behind me felt miles away. I took a shaky step forward. "Emily," I said, voice cracking. "Emily, can you hear me? It's me. We have to get out of here." She tilted her head. "Why did you come back, Rachel?" Her voice was layered again, but there was a faint quiver that might have been Emily's real self. "What do you mean, back?" I asked, choking on the stale air. Her lips curled. "You were here once before, as a child." That made no sense to me on the surface, but somewhere, a piece of my memory shifted. A glimpse of me standing in these dark woods as a kid holding someone's hand, a woman's hand. My aunt, she had taken me camping once, but I'd blocked out most of those memories. "What did you do to Danny?" I demanded, tears stinging my eyes. She turned her gaze to the skeleton. "He was in the way. He would have tried to save you." I clenched my fists. "Save me from what?" "Your destiny," she paused, her eyes flickering with a strange sorrow. "But maybe you can save me." I stepped closer. The skeleton was hideous up close, the vines weaving in and out of the ribs like living serpents. The skull angled slightly, as if watching me. "She needs a vessel," Emily said quietly, stroking a vine. "She almost had me fully, but you fought back. You always fight." Yeah, the swirling sense of unreality battered me. My oldest friend was possessed, spouting cryptic statements about a witch's skeleton in a hole under a cabin. The moment I looked into that eyeless skull, I felt it pulling at me. Then I remembered the whispers. "Rachel, you came back." It was the same voice I realized that had woken me at night. She had latched onto me as a child, perhaps failing to take me then. Now she wanted a second chance. I had to destroy it. Without thinking further, I lunged forward and grabbed the nearest vine, ripping it from the skeleton's ribs. The bone snapped under my grip, brittle. The skeleton let out a high-pitched, keening wail. Or maybe it was in my head. Emily shrieked, clutching at her temples. The chamber felt like it was spinning. I let out a cry and threw the vine aside, then seized the old bones, trying to break them apart. "No!" Emily shouted, but it was a voice layered with something inhuman. She hurled herself at me, knocking me to the ground. My flashlight skittered away, landing to shine on us in an oblique angle. Her hands closed around my throat, nails biting into my skin. She was unbelievably strong. I fought for air, tried to pry her hands loose, but she pinned me. Tears streamed down her cheeks as her face twisted with anger and sorrow. "Don't," she hissed. Desperate, I fumbled in my pocket for anything, my fingers brushing the jagged piece of wood I had jammed there after hacking the vine near Danny. I pulled it out, trembling. In one violent motion, I drove the splintered end into Emily's shoulder. She let out a screech and released her grip on my neck. I gasped for breath, vision swimming. She staggered back, pressing a hand to her wound, blackish fluid mingling with red blood. "Emily!" I sobbed, tears burning my cheeks. She gave me a hollow, anguished stare. "I can't stop her." Then, with a thunderous crack, the chamber wall near the skeleton split. Vines erupted, slithering around my ankles, forcing me away from the bones. Emily let out a broken wail, and I realized she was trying to fight from the inside. Summoning every ounce of will, I kicked off the vines. I scrambled to the skeleton, ignoring the panic pounding in my chest. My hand grasped the bleached skull. It felt slick with moisture. I recalled how the fire burned blue. Fire. I needed to use fire. That might be the only way to break the witch's hold, to destroy whatever cursed remains lay here. I was far underground, but I remembered that the trapdoor overhead led to a fireplace. I screamed at Emily, "Help me get it up there. We can burn it." Her face twitched, a war raging inside her. For a moment, she was Emily, tears streaming. She nodded, quickly bending to scoop up the chest of the skeleton, ignoring the vines that lashed at her ankles. She gave me a panicked glance, and together we half carried, half dragged the remains up the corridor. The bones jerked in our hands. I heard a scraping sound in my head like nails on glass. My heart thundered, but we kept climbing. Once we reached the ladder, we realized the challenge. Emily started to falter, as though the presence inside her was reasserting control. "Go," she whispered, pushing me forward. "Destroy it." I hoisted myself up through the trapdoor, pulling the skeleton by its bony arms. The skull rattled, as if resisting. Suddenly, Emily cried out below. I turned to see her eyes rolling back, her limbs seizing. The vines from the corridor lashed up around her waist, trying to drag her down. "Rachel!" she screamed, half in her own voice, half in that alien rasp. In that moment, I realized saving Emily might be impossible if I didn't destroy the skeleton immediately. So I yanked harder, pulling as many bones onto the cabin floor as I could. The chest, the spinal column, the arms. The only piece that stayed behind was a portion of the leg, entangled in vines. I let out a primal yell and slammed the trapdoor shut on the vines, severing them. They hissed like living snakes. The fireplace was cold, but a few embers lingered. I scrambled for the spare kindling we had, dumping it in, stirring the coals until they glowed. Then I wrestled the skeleton's torso onto the grate. The skull clacked in protest, jaw snapping open in a silent shriek. My breath came in ragged heaves as I rummaged for anything flammable. Our last scraps of paper, bits of dry cloth from my pack. With trembling hands, I coaxed the embers to a flame. The wood took on that eerie bluish color. I piled the bones over it, ignoring my terror that the cabin might collapse. I just needed it to burn. The skeleton started to blacken, smoke curling up in tendrils that stung my eyes. A shriek, louder than anything before, rang out from the trapdoor. It reverberated through the cabin. I dropped to my knees, hands over my ears. The temperature soared. The flames fanned, bright and hungry. The skull's jaw charred and cracked, a wisp of dark fluid oozing out. I threw more broken wood on top. The shriek died into a low hiss, and then silence. Panting, I waited. 5 seconds, 10, 30, each one an eternity. The skeleton collapsed into itself, the vines curling in the flames. I thought I heard a final moan in the distance, but it faded quickly. My mind swirled. Below me, the trapdoor was quiet. No more thrashing vines or maniacal shrieking. My ears rang from the final wail. I rushed over and yanked the trapdoor open again. The corridor was dark, no sign of movement. "Emily?" I called, voice echoing. There was no answer. I could barely see anything. Adrenaline surged. I climbed down, flashlight in hand. The corridor was empty, the vines limp. Further in, near the chamber, I found Emily slumped on the ground. Her breathing was shallow, a pool of dark fluid around her. She was unconscious, or close to it. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought she was dead, but her chest rose and fell. I pressed my fingers to her neck. Her pulse was weak, but there. With great difficulty, I half lifted, half dragged her up the corridor and up the ladder into the cabin. Her shoulder wound from my makeshift spike was bleeding again, and she had additional scrapes from the vines. I laid her on the floor. For a moment, she came to, blinking slowly. Her eyes were no longer glazed. "Rachel, did we?" she whispered. "We burned it," I said, tears welling up. "You're free. Just hold on." She tried to speak, but only a small sound came out. She closed her eyes, drifting into unconsciousness once more. Fear pulsed inside me. Danny was dead, and Emily was on the brink. I had to get her out of this cursed place. I rummaged for bandages, found some in her kit, pressed them onto her shoulder. Then I realized there was no safe place to rest here. The vines were dead. The skeleton was a smoldering heap, but the cabin reeked of decay and smoke. The roof threatened to collapse in places. We needed to leave. I managed to drag Emily outside. Dawn was breaking, the sky a pale gray beyond the trees. It might have been morning. Time was still too strange to track. I laid her in a patch of soft ferns, propping her head on my pack. As I turned to look back at the cabin, a wave of surreal calm washed over me. It was done. The presence was gone, or so I hoped. I was sure we wouldn't survive if we stayed, so I did the only thing I could. I started walking, carrying Emily as best I could in a fireman's carry. She weighed more than me, but adrenaline and desperation propelled me forward. The forest was silent. I don't remember how long I walked. Maybe an hour, maybe more. Eventually, I stumbled onto a faint footpath, then heard distant voices. A group of hikers wearing bright clothes and carrying trekking poles stepped out from behind a bend in the trail. They froze, eyes wide as they saw me half carrying, half dragging my unconscious friend. I must have been a frightful sight, covered in dirt and dried blood, trembling, my eyes wild. They helped me lay Emily down, offered water, called out for a medic. One of them had a phone that picked up a faint signal. They said they were near a major trail not far from a ranger station. I collapsed, weeping, muttering incoherently about a cabin and a witch. They tried to calm me. "Slow down," they said. "You're in shock." My mind spun. I lost consciousness not long after, my last thought a swirl of vines, bones, and the faint image of Danny nailed to the fireplace wall. When I woke again, I was in a hospital bed. My throat burned, my body ached. The nurses asked me questions, but I had no voice left to explain. Eventually, the park rangers came to take my statement. I told them everything, or most of it. They asked if I had done any drugs, if I was delirious from dehydration. They said they found no sign of a stone cabin where I claimed it was, and no sign of a body or bones. They did find some disturbed ground, but it might have been from a fallen tree. They couldn't locate Danny's remains, or Danny at all. The official story was that he got lost, and a search was ongoing. Emily was in another room, stable, but traumatized. I overheard a nurse mention that her injuries might have been from an animal attack. I wanted to scream. It wasn't an animal. But I kept silent. None of them would believe the truth. In the days that followed, Emily hardly spoke, but her eyes sometimes flicked to me with a haunted knowledge. We both know what happened out there was real. The nights I spent in the hospital, I had nightmares of the trapdoor, the skeleton, the vines. Sometimes I woke up hearing that whisper, "Rachel, you came back." My throat would constrict until I reassured myself I was far from those cursed ruins. I was discharged with instructions to rest and see a therapist for possible PTSD. Emily was discharged a week later, quieter and more frail than I've ever known her. She visited me once, bringing a black candle. I asked why she had it. She said she felt compelled to buy it, that she remembered the smell of the blue flame. We stared at each other in silent understanding. Whatever we destroyed, we'd left something behind in ourselves. Some nights, I dream of that burning skeleton, the horrifying wail, and I wake to see my reflection in a mirror that briefly looks like a skull. They never found Danny's body. The official paperwork lists him as a missing person in the Catoctin Mountain area. I gave the rangers the best directions I could, but the forest has a way of swallowing evidence. I saw pity in their eyes, the way they patronized me with condolences. They never believed my tale of a cursed skeleton in a living cabin. And so the official story remains that Daniel Klein disappeared in the wilderness, and Emily and I nearly died from a combination of misadventure, heat exhaustion, and shock. The truth is less palatable. Sometimes, in those rare moments Emily and I can bear to talk about it, we remember different details. She claims that in her possessed state, she saw me as a child, kneeling in that same chamber, holding an older woman's hand. But I have no conscious recollection of that, only a fleeting vision of a woman in a wide-brimmed hat, humming a lullaby in those dark corridors. My aunt, I suspect. She disappeared on a camping trip years ago, an event my family rarely discusses. The parallels are too close. I wish I could give you a happy ending, something that ties it up with a neat bow, but that's not reality. My nights are still plagued by whispers and flickers of a blue flame. Emily is physically healing, but her mental scars are deeper. She's told me that sometimes, when she drifts off to sleep, she feels vines tightening around her limbs, or sees Danny's face twisted in silent agony. Neither of us goes near Catoctin Mountain Park anymore. I moved away from D.C., left my analytics job behind. I told people I wanted a fresh start, but really, I can't be near forests. I still don't know if we killed that presence or just banished it temporarily. The park is old, the land older. There may be others who stumble off the beaten trail, who find the cabin or get caught in time loops and meet something unspeakable beneath the ground. Maybe it's hunting a new host, even as I write this. As for me, I can't shake the feeling that part of it followed me out. Sometimes, late at night, I look at the door to my apartment and think I see a faint vine creeping around the frame, or a flicker of movement just out of sight. My mirror sometimes glows with a faint blue reflection. I question my sanity daily, but I know what I saw, what I did, who I lost. That's the truth of what happened in August 2024. I am Rachel Carr, 28, and these are the last words I have the courage to write about that cursed trip. Whether you believe me or not, if you ever find yourself on an unmarked path near Hog Rock Overlook, and you stumble upon a mossy stone cabin, do not go inside. If you hear your name whispered at night, run, because something old and hungry lives in that darkness, and once it knows you, it may never let you go.